Thank you for joining us today and listening to this audiobook. We truly appreciate your time and support. Before we dive into the story, I'd like to invite you to do something that means the world to us. Please like, comment, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. By doing so, you're not just staying connected, you're becoming part of an exclusive community dedicated to celebrating knowledge, culture, and empowerment. If you're interested in the ebook or paperback edition of this audiobook, head over to our Amazon page. You'll find the link in the description below. And for those of you looking to show your support in other ways, we've got custom t-shirts, hoodies, and beautiful African wall art available. Just click the merchandise link in the description to check it out. Once again, thank you for being here with us. Your engagement means everything. It helps us continue creating meaningful content and building a space where we can all grow together. So please take a moment now to like, comment, and subscribe. It's more than just a click. It's your way of saying you're with us on this journey. Thank you and enjoy the audiobook.
Dr. Gavin Harrell presents a never-ending Black history series, People, Places, and Things. The Dark Legacy of Southern Black Codes, How Post-Civil War Laws Were Engineered to Suppress African American Freedom. Book 2. Introduction. On April 12, 1861, the Union and Confederacy embarked on a conflict that would become the most brutal, bloodiest, and costliest war in North American history. The American Civil War, a protracted and hard-fought battle, raged for 4 years, culminating in the Union's victory on May 9, 1865. This war was waged over deeply opposing ideals, and its conclusion saw the liberation of over 4 million enslaved Africans from the brutal bonds of chattel slavery. While some among the newly freed welcomed their long-awaited freedom, others faced it with fear and uncertainty, a reflection of the immense challenges that lay ahead. For many Southern planters, the emancipation of slaves represented not just the loss of property, but a fundamental alteration of their way of life, fueling a hostility toward the freedmen that would persist for generations. The question that gripped both the South and North in the war's aftermath was clear. What was to be done with the freed slaves? The Republicans, led by President Abraham Lincoln, sought to integrate the freedmen into society, paving the way for their full citizenship. In stark contrast, the Democrats aimed to return the freedmen to conditions as close to slavery as possible. Under Lincoln's direction, the federal government established the Freedmen's Bureau, an agency tasked with reuniting families torn apart by the war and providing essential education in literacy, a skill the freedmen desperately craved. However, the South did not stand idly by. In response to the federal government's efforts, Southern legislatures resurrected old slave codes and devised a new set of racially motivated laws known as the Black Codes. These laws were explicitly designed to restrict the mobility of the freedmen and coerce them into exploitative labor contracts. The Freedmen's Bureau, though initially intended to protect and support the freedmen, often found itself acting as a quasi-labor agency, brokering agreements that effectively returned many freedmen to the very plantations from which they had recently been liberated. The Bureau oversaw the labor contracts between freedmen and their former masters, leaving the freedmen with little choice but to accept employment under conditions that bore a striking resemblance to slavery. In cities across the South, white citizens conspired to suppress the economic potential of the freedmen by capping wages and requiring certificates of employment, which often had to be obtained from former slaveholders. The end of Reconstruction in 1877, marked by the Compromise of 1877 and the withdrawal of federal troops from the South, signaled the beginning of a new era of oppression. The Black Codes, which had already begun to reshape Southern society, rapidly evolved into a comprehensive system of economic, political, and legal subjugation that effectively re-enslaved African Americans under the guise of legality. The Constitution of the American Freedmen's Aid Union aimed to assist freedmen in overcoming the myriad challenges posed by their newfound freedom, promoting their rise from the degradation of slavery to full citizenship. Yet, this mission was systematically undermined by the Black Codes, which were designed to perpetuate the conditions of slavery under a different name. Among the most egregious of the Black Codes were the vagrancy laws, which criminalized unemployment and forced African American men into menial labor that white citizens refused to perform. These laws required black men to carry proof of employment, failure to do so often resulted in arrests and forced labor. The pig laws and the convict leasing system further entrenched this exploitation, turning the criminal justice system into a tool for economic exploitation. Sharecropping, apprenticeship, and anti-enticement laws further restricted the freedoms of African Americans, ensuring their dependence on the very system that had enslaved them. The subsequent chapters will delve into the intricacies of these laws, exploring their ideological underpinnings and practical implications. The vagrancy laws of the South, the pig laws, and the convict leasing system will be examined in depth, revealing the ways in which they perpetuated a system of racial subjugation. The discussion will extend to the mechanisms of apprenticeship, anti-enticement laws, and sharecropping, each of which played a role in maintaining the socio-economic status quo in the post-bellum South. The Southern view of the freedmen, shaped by a legacy of racial hierarchy, will also be explored. The conclusion will trace the fall of the black codes and their insidious transformation into Jim Crow laws, highlighting the ongoing struggle for civil rights and the measures taken by African Americans and their allies to combat these oppressive systems. Through this study, the persistent and pervasive impact of the black codes on African Americans will be brought to light, illustrating how these laws laid the groundwork for a century of segregation, violence, and systemic discrimination. The Southern states, in the aftermath of the Civil War, swiftly began drafting and enacting racially motivated laws known as the Black Codes. These laws were explicitly designed to curtail the rights of newly freed African Americans and their descendants. This legislative action was a direct response to the series of constitutional amendments passed during the Reconstruction period, which aimed to extend civil rights to black people. The central issue to be examined is the implementation of these black codes across the South following the conclusion of the Civil War, and the profound negative impact they had on black citizens who were subjected to these racially discriminatory laws. The origins of these black codes can be traced back to the emancipation of slavery in 1865, marking the end of the Civil War. From that moment through the early 20th century, resistance against these racially inspired laws began to grow. The black codes were particularly insidious because they specifically targeted the black population throughout the southern states, seeking to undermine any progress that might have been made toward economic, social, and educational advancement. Had it not been for the destructive influence of these laws, black communities in the South might have experienced greater financial stability, social cohesion, and educational opportunities. Southern states crafted and passed these laws with the intent to maintain social and economic control over the newly freed African American population. For instance, the Mississippi Black Code prohibited any person of black origin within the state from carrying firearms or ammunition of any kind. This law left the newly emancipated population defenseless against the violent raids, beatings, and lynchings that became rampant after the war. Although the specifics of the black codes varied across states, they collectively worked to ensure the continued dominance of Southern whites over black people, reinforcing a system of economic and social oppression. When the Civil War ended in 1865, the defeated Confederate states did not abandon their efforts to control the black population. Instead, they rebranded their slave codes, giving rise to what became known as the Black Codes. Just as the slave codes had served as legal frameworks to manage and control the enslaved population, the Black Codes functioned in a similar capacity for the newly freed African Americans. From the end of the Civil War in 1865 through the early 20th century, these codes were not only enacted, but were actively enforced to suppress nearly every aspect of the lives of African Americans in the South. These racially inspired laws were designed to maintain the status quo, ensuring that the social and economic hierarchies established during slavery persisted well into the Reconstruction era and beyond. The impact of the Black Codes on the black population, particularly in the southern states, was devastating. These laws were not merely a continuation of the oppressive practices of slavery, but were a calculated effort to undermine the potential progress of black citizens in every conceivable way. A thorough examination of the methodology behind the Black Codes, their functionality, and their intended purposes is essential to understanding this dark period in American history. While the overarching goal of the Black Codes was to suppress and limit the activities and freedoms of black people, each law served its own specific function. There were the pig laws, which criminalized minor offenses with severe penalties, the vagrancy laws, which targeted unemployed black men and forced them into labor, the convict leasing system, which effectively re-enslaved those who were incarcerated, and the apprenticeship laws, anti-enticement laws, and sharecropping systems, which were all designed to exploit and control the black workforce. This study will break down each of these laws, explaining their impacts on the black population and the resistance they encountered. It will also explore how these various laws were effective in fulfilling their intended purposes, namely the continued subjugation of African Americans in the postbellum South. By analyzing the specific mechanisms of the black codes, we can gain a deeper understanding of the systematic nature of racial oppression during this period and the long-lasting effects these laws had on the black community. About the author, there is a kind of gratitude that rises up from the depths of one's soul, not so much a celebration of survival, but a recognition of the strength it took to survive. My story, like so many stories, is one of hardship, of pain, and of faith, a faith that was not born of certainty, but of necessity. I was 7 years old when I was abandoned by my parents, cast adrift in a world that seemed indifferent to my existence. The journey from childhood to manhood was not a journey at all, but a sudden, brutal shift. By 12, I was on the streets, alone, abandoned, with nothing but the will to keep breathing. The streets became both my home and my battleground. Each day presented new challenges, testing my resolve and pushing the limits of my endurance. It was a time of immense struggle, where every moment was a fight for survival. Yet, in the face of these adversities, I discovered a wellspring of strength within myself that I never knew existed. This strength was not just physical, but emotional and spiritual. Today I stand as a testament to the power of perseverance and faith. My journey is a reminder that even in the bleakest moments, there is always a spark of hope. It was through God's grace and my own determination that I was able to navigate these treacherous waters. Each day was a testament to my resolve, shaping me into the person I am today. And as I reflect on the man I have become, I must give thanks to the woman who has walked beside me, my wife, Dr. Nicole Boatswain Harrow. Her unwavering support, her dedication, her brilliance, these have been my anchor. Nicole's work in the world of developmental education is nothing short of extraordinary. She is a force, a light, and she has shown me what it means to commit oneself fully to a cause, to a purpose. To my son, Ethan, you are the reason I strive every day to be better, to be stronger, to be the man I want you to look up to. Your spirit, your drive, your energy, they inspire me in ways I cannot even begin to describe. As I have walked this path, I have found a way to merge my passions, my experiences, my beliefs. I have dedicated myself to the study of history, earning my master's and doctoral degrees, focusing on African American studies, law, and government. But my academic pursuits are not separate from my life. They are informed by it. My academic pursuits are paralleled by my extensive experience in law enforcement, a journey that began in 2004. As a law enforcement police veteran, I have served with distinction, currently holding the position of police lieutenant in Washington, D.C. In this role, I manage a significant number of police officers and police supervisors, which demonstrates my exemplary leadership and an unwavering commitment to public safety and community service. My tenure as a detective in the Criminal Investigation Division, where I conducted extensive high-level criminal investigations, honed my skills in conducting thorough interviews, meticulous research, and precise evidence gathering. These experiences, both the hardships I have endured and the professional paths I have walked, have not only shaped who I am, but they have also shaped the way I approach my work as a historian. I bring the same rigor, the same attention to detail, the same relentless pursuit of truth to my historical research as I do to my work in law enforcement. Because in the end, whether I am uncovering a piece of history or investigating a crime, I am driven by the same thing, a desire to see justice done, to see the truth brought to light, to see that every story, every life is given the dignity it deserves. Chapter 1. The Pig Law. In 1865, as the dust of the Civil War settled, Southern city and state authorities found themselves grappling with an unprecedented challenge: how to integrate 4 million newly emancipated African Americans into a society that had, until then, been built on their subjugation. This challenge quickly became one of the most critical issues confronting the South. Among the tools used to navigate this perceived problem were the Pig Laws, statutes designed explicitly to restrict the daily lives of the freedmen in the post-war South. These laws, which remained in effect for decades, were part of a broader suite of racially motivated legislation passed by the southern states of the former Confederacy. Pig laws were particularly pernicious in that they effectively criminalized the impoverished black community for petty offenses such as the unauthorized taking of common farm animals like chickens and pigs. Violating these laws could lead to jail time, fines, and, crucially, the loss of the right to vote. This practice of disenfranchising individuals for minor misdemeanors was unprecedented and served as a civil death sentence for many newly freed slaves and their descendants. For the first time in their lives, the freedmen had the freedom to decide when, where, and for how long they would work. However, those who could not find employment often found themselves wandering from town to town, begging for food or jobs. In Florida, a black man named Cuffy Washington became a stark example of how the pig laws were used to strip African Americans of their newfound rights. In 1880, Washington attempted to cast his vote in the congressional election in Ocala, Florida. Upon entering the polling area, members of the Democratic Party challenged his right to vote, citing his recent conviction for stealing 3 oranges. Despite the minor nature of the offense, Washington was barred from voting, a common fate for many black men and women under the pig laws. Washington's experience was not unique. He explained that many African Americans in his area were similarly charged and convicted of petty crimes, particularly as elections approached. This pattern of increased arrests and convictions during election seasons was a deliberate tactic used to disenfranchise black voters who were expected to overwhelmingly support the Republican Party. In Ocala, Florida, this practice became so prevalent that it drew national attention. Allen Green, another victim of the pig laws, echoed Washington's sentiments. Green, accused of hog theft, noted that the arrest and conviction of black men for minor offenses often spiked just before elections. This practice ensured that many potential black voters were effectively silenced, preserving the political power of Southern Democrats. Pippa Holloway, in her article, "A Chicken Stealer Shall Lose His Vote: Disfranchisement for Larceny in the South, 1874 to 1890, highlights how Ocala, Florida saw more instances of petty charges and convictions during this period than any other documented time, underscoring the systemic nature of this form of voter suppression. The pig laws were not merely about punishing minor infractions, they were a calculated effort to maintain white supremacy in the South by stripping African Americans of their political power and economic autonomy. These laws, alongside other racially inspired legislation, were instrumental in perpetuating the legacy of slavery long after its formal abolition, ensuring that the freedmen remained subordinate to their former masters. One of the primary missions and objectives of the pig laws in Florida was to disenfranchise black citizens, a calculated effort by white members of the Democratic Party to reclaim their political dominance after the Reconstruction era. The cases of individuals like Cuffy Washington and Allen Green, along with countless others, illustrate the brutal efficiency of this new political strategy. The pig laws, which allowed for the denial of voting rights to those convicted of minor offenses, were instrumental in suppressing the black vote. Although these laws did not explicitly target a specific race, they were almost exclusively enforced against black people. From 1874 to 1882, Southern states systematically amended their constitutions and revised their laws to disenfranchise freedmen for petty theft. This was a deliberate part of a broader effort to marginalize the overwhelmingly Republican black electorate and restore the Democratic Party's dominance in the South. These statutes were powerful tools for excluding Republican voters from participating in some of the most hotly contested elections of the period. The experiences of Washington and Green were far from isolated. In Marengo County, Alabama, a similar situation unfolded the day before an election. A white Democratic Party staffer, Ed Williams, confronted a black man named Silas Green, questioning whether Silas would be allowed to vote. Despite Silas's protestations that he had never been convicted of a crime and had been acquitted in court, Williams read him a section of the Alabama Constitution that disenfranchised individuals convicted of certain offenses. The intimidation was enough. Silas did not show up to cast his vote the next day, fearing the consequences of attempting to do so. In this way, the pig laws were devastatingly effective in rendering the black community politically powerless. Silas's case, despite his legal acquittal, underscores the broader impact of these laws. Even the mere threat of legal repercussions was sufficient to deter many from exercising their right to vote. This system of legal intimidation and disenfranchisement ensured that black citizens were systematically excluded from the political process, further entrenching white supremacy in the post-Reconstruction South. In Staunton, Virginia, the oppressive reach of the pig laws was on full display when James McGuffin, a freedman, entered a courthouse to exercise his right to vote. Before McGuffin could even cast his ballot, a white Democrat intervened, claiming that McGuffin had been convicted of petty larceny the previous year, thereby rendering him ineligible to vote. McGuffin vehemently denied these allegations, yet the specter of the pig laws loomed large. Despite the Democrats' challenge, the presiding judge allowed McGuffin to cast his ballot. However, no sooner had McGuffin voted than he was immediately arrested by a police officer and charged with illegal voting. This incident exemplifies the vast and arbitrary power that the pig laws granted to white Democrats in the South, particularly in Virginia. In Staunton, the mere accusation of a pig law violation without any substantiated evidence was enough to strip a black person of their right to vote. Even when a judge permitted McGuffin to vote, the unproven allegation alone was sufficient grounds for his arrest. This case underscores how the pig laws were used not only to disenfranchise black voters, but also to intimidate and suppress any political activity among the freedmen. On the same day McGuffin was unjustly arrested, another black man, Richard Harris, attempted to vote in Gloucester County, Virginia. Harris, who was illiterate, was questioned by a precinct judge about whether he had ever been convicted of petty larceny. Trying to answer truthfully, Harris admitted that he had been convicted of such a crime. On this basis, the judge denied him the right to vote. However, a later congressional investigation revealed that there were no records of Harris ever being convicted of larceny. Although he had been indicted for felonious assault, those charges were dismissed, and the case never went to trial. These cases illustrate the deeply entrenched racial prejudice and the deliberate manipulation of the legal system by white Democrats to maintain political control. The pig laws were not merely laws, they were tools of systemic oppression designed to ensure that black people remained powerless and excluded from the political process. Through the use of these laws, the Democrats effectively silenced the voices of countless freedmen, ensuring their own continued dominance in the South. Harris, being an illiterate man, likely did not grasp the distinctions between felonious assault and larceny, or the critical difference between being charged with a crime and being convicted of one. The trumped-up assault charges against him were dismissed before he ever appeared in court, adding to the confusion he must have faced. His inability to navigate these legal nuances was a vulnerability easily exploited by those intent on suppressing the black vote in Virginia. Harris's experience was not unique. Similar instances plagued black residents throughout the state, where the active enforcement of pig laws systematically hindered, deprived, and suppressed their ability to vote. Following the Civil War, Section 2 of the 14th Amendment aimed to punish states that disenfranchised people for reasons unrelated to rebellion or other serious crimes. However, the allowance of disenfranchisement as punishment for other crimes was later interpreted by the courts to include misdemeanor and felony offenses. This broad interpretation alarmed Republicans in Congress, who feared that the South could use this provision to disenfranchise individuals for even minor offenses, as the amendment did not specify which crimes could justify such a punishment. In response, Congress took action. On March 2, 1867, during the enactment of the first Reconstruction Act, Congress established standards for the new Southern state constitutions, placing strict limitations on disenfranchisement for crimes. Under these new restrictions, individuals could only be disenfranchised if convicted of a felony offense. This requirement was reinforced by subsequent acts that restored the Southern states to the Union, reflecting Congress's intention to protect the voting rights of all citizens, regardless of race or political affiliation. Before these amendments, the Southern states' practice of voter suppression through pig laws went largely unchecked and uncontested, operating without fear of penalty. The new amendments, however, clearly articulated that disenfranchisement was only permissible for certain felonies, signaling Congress's concern that Southern courts were abusing their power by disenfranchising individuals for petty crimes. During the 1870s, as it became evident that the federal government was serious about enforcing the post-war amendments that protected black people in the South, Southern Democrats were emboldened in their efforts to reclaim political power. They employed violence and fraud as their primary tools to deter Republican voters and reassert their dominance. The primary targets of these efforts were the freedmen, who overwhelmingly supported the Republican Party. In their bid to suppress the black vote, every former Confederate state, except Texas, modified their laws, specifically the pig laws, to disenfranchise individuals based on convictions for petty crimes. These actions illustrate the lengths to which Southern Democrats were willing to go to maintain white supremacy and political control, even in the face of federal efforts to protect the rights of black citizens. The Pig Laws were more than just legal statutes. They were weapons wielded in the ongoing battle to undermine black political agency and uphold a social order rooted in racial hierarchy. On December 29, 1865, in Richmond, Virginia, a stark example of the oppressive enforcement of Pig Laws was witnessed when police officers arrested more than a dozen freedmen. These individuals were jailed and forced into involuntary servitude for violating racially inspired laws designed to control and punish the newly freed black population. The Richmond Daily Dispatch, a local newspaper, reported on several cases that illustrated the discriminatory application of these laws. Frank Hall, a black man, was arraigned on charges of petty theft, convicted, and sentenced to a month in Castle Thunder, a former Civil War prison. In stark contrast, George Washington, a white man charged with disorderly conduct, was found not guilty, while John Lewis, a black man facing the same charge, was sentenced to 10 days in Castle Thunder. Similarly, Charles Reed, another black man, was arrested for petty larceny, pleaded guilty, and received a 1-month sentence in the same facility. The underlying ideology of the Pig Laws was rooted in the belief that black people were inherently predisposed to committing certain crimes. This racist assumption was used to justify the creation of laws that disproportionately affected the black community, particularly in suppressing their right to vote. While Southern Democrats sought to disenfranchise both black and white Republicans, historical evidence clearly shows that the primary target of the Pig Laws was the black population. In response to the constitutional amendments that allowed for disenfranchisement only for felonies, several Southern states reclassified misdemeanor property crimes as felonies. Southern states amended their constitutions to include petty larceny as a disenfranchising offense. By the 1870s, 2 Southern states that previously had not disenfranchised anyone for a crime revised their constitutions to make larceny a disenfranchising offense. Southern courts then interpreted these laws to include misdemeanor offenses as disenfranchising crimes. Over time, statutory revisions, constitutional amendments, and judicial actions collectively expanded the penalties for petty theft, effectively disenfranchising large segments of the black community. Between 1874 and 1876, 4 Southern states explicitly broadened the definition of a felony to include minor property offenses that were previously categorized as misdemeanors. The impact of these disfranchising laws was profound. In the Southern states that adopted similar laws, over 300,000 black citizens were effectively disqualified from serving as jurors. This exclusion further solidified the Southern states' advantage in criminal legislation, as freedmen were barred from participating in the judicial process. The Supreme Court of Mississippi even went so far as to declare that black people were inherently furtive and predisposed to committing certain offenses, attributing this to the peculiarities of their habits and character. Consequently, misdemeanor offenses committed by freedmen were often reclassified as felonies, leading to far harsher penalties than those imposed on white individuals for more severe crime. Crimes. Among the various Southern states' Pig Laws, Mississippi's 1876 law stood out as the most infamous. Prior to 1876, grand larceny in Mississippi, a felony offense, was defined as the unlawful taking of anything worth more than $25. The reclassification of petty larceny as a felony under the Pig Laws meant that minor thefts by black individuals, which would have previously been considered misdemeanors, now carried the weight of a felony conviction, resulting in severe penalties and the loss of voting rights. This legal manipulation was a calculated effort to maintain white supremacy and suppress black political and social power in the post-Civil War South. The Pig Law of 1876 marked a significant escalation in the legal framework designed to disenfranchise black citizens in the post-Reconstruction South. By broadening the scope of what constituted grand larceny, the law lowered the threshold for a theft to be classified as a felony from $25 to a mere $10. This reduction meant that even the theft of an item worth only $10 could now result in a felony conviction, with the severe consequence of losing the right to vote. The law did not stop there. It specifically targeted the theft of livestock, a common and accessible source of sustenance for the newly freed black population. Under this law, the unlawful taking, removal, or possession of a steer, bull, sheep, lamb, goat, pig, hog, yearling, calf, or cow valued at just $1 or more was classified as grand larceny, a felony offense. The implications of this law were devastating. In many instances, property worth less than $10 was still considered grand larceny under the expanded definition, leading to harsh penalties disproportionate to the offense. The pig law was not merely about punishing theft, it was a strategic tool used to strip black citizens of their political rights. By redefining what constituted a felony, the law effectively widened the net to ensnare a greater number of black individuals in the criminal justice system, thereby disenfranchising them and reinforcing white political dominance. This legal manipulation was part of a broader strategy to maintain the social and economic order of the South by undermining the newfound freedom and rights of the black population. The Pig Law of 1876, like other black codes, was a clear attempt to subvert the gains of Reconstruction by creating legal barriers that would keep black citizens in a state of subjugation, despite their emancipation. The law's focus on livestock theft, items that were often essential for survival, further underscored the calculated nature of these efforts to weaken black communities and ensure their continued marginalization. In 1875, Alabama's political leaders took decisive steps to tighten their grip on the newly emancipated black population through strategic amendments to both state statutes and the Constitution. These changes aimed to disfranchise, indefinitely, anyone convicted of even minor agricultural theft, effectively ensuring that those who were most vulnerable and likely to be accused of such offenses, black citizens, would be stripped of their political power. The provisions in Alabama were part of a broader concerted effort across the South to reassert white dominance in the aftermath of Reconstruction. That same year in February, Alabama Democrats further entrenched their control by amending the Penal Code to expand the range of offenses classified as felonies, thereby increasing the number of crimes punishable by penitentiary sentences. This move was mirrored in Arkansas, where the legislature during the 1874 to 1875 session redefined what constituted felony grand larceny. In Arkansas, the theft of any item valued at more than $2 was now classified as a felony, a severe escalation that reflected the South's determination to criminalize black life. The implications of these changes were far-reaching. By upgrading minor larcenies to felony offenses, Arkansas ensured that even trivial thefts, such as the theft of a cow, regardless of its value, would result in a felony conviction, leading to disfranchisement. This systematic approach to expanding the penal code served as a tool of racial control, leveraging the legal system to curtail the rights of black citizens under the guise of law and order. The inclusion of petty thefts and minor larcenies as felony offenses was not just about punishing crime. It was a deliberate tactic to suppress the political agency of the black population, ensuring that they remained disenfranchised and marginalized within the socio-political landscape of the post-Reconstruction South. The Pig Laws of the South were multifaceted in their impact, serving several insidious purposes beyond the primary objective of disfranchising black citizens. These laws played a crucial role in supporting the convict leasing system, a system that essentially re-enslaved black men by keeping jails and prisons filled with able-bodied individuals who could be leased out for labor. The economic benefit to the South was immense, as it provided a cheap labor force that replaced the economic vacuum left by the abolition of slavery. By criminalizing minor offenses and inflating the penalties associated with them, the Pig Laws ensured a steady supply of labor for the convict leasing system. Moreover, the Pig Laws allowed Southern Democrats to highlight what they framed as a significant problem of theft, which they attributed to the alleged failure of the Republican ruling party to maintain order in the South. By emphasizing the prevalence of theft, particularly livestock thefts, which posed a substantial threat to small landholders who relied on their animals as a primary source of protein, Democrats sought to rally lower-class whites to their cause. This strategic move helped to secure the allegiance of lower-class whites, who felt increasingly marginalized in the post-war economy. Initially, the constitutions of Southern states did not explicitly include provisions for disfranchisement related to the criminal offense of larceny. However, each state gradually expanded the number of offenses categorized as felonies, particularly those related to petty theft and minor property crimes. This expansion served as a loophole that allowed Southern states to increase the number of disfranchising offenses without directly violating the constitutional protections that were supposed to be in place following the Civil War. In 1875, Republican legislators from Alabama petitioned Congress to protest the pending legislation that sought to expand the definition of grand larceny. These Republicans argued that the reclassification of misdemeanor thefts as felonies was politically motivated, designed to suppress the black vote and consolidate white Democratic power. They revealed the ulterior motives behind these legislative changes, pointing out that the new laws equipped white Democrats with the means to persecute and oppress the freedmen. By making minor crimes punishable by both disfranchisement and incarceration, the Democrats could systematically strip black citizens of their newly won rights and force them back into a state of subjugation. This deliberate manipulation of the legal system underscores the broader strategy employed by Southern Democrats to reassert control over the black population. Through the pig laws, they not only disenfranchised thousands of black voters, but also reinforced the racial hierarchy that had been temporarily disrupted by the Civil War and Reconstruction. The pig laws, therefore, were not just about criminal justice. They were a calculated effort to undermine the political and social gains of the freedmen and to maintain white supremacy in the postbellum South. The criminal acts committed by black individuals, particularly those involving petty theft, were often rationalized, excused, and explained by their white Republican allies and black politicians. They argued that these crimes were driven by necessity, a direct result of the dire economic circumstances in which many black people found themselves in the post-Civil War South. This perspective framed such crimes as acts of survival rather than criminal behavior, an argument rooted in empathy and an understanding of the systemic inequalities that continue to oppress the black community. However, Southern Democrats vehemently opposed this view, arguing that these petty crimes, such as the theft of chickens, were indicative of what they perceived as the inherent impulsiveness and inferiority of the black race. To them, these acts of theft were not just crimes, but were symbolic of a deeper, racialized flaw that, in their minds, disqualified black people from the rights of citizenship and the right to vote. The Democrats used these incidents to reinforce and propagate racist stereotypes, suggesting that the black population was unfit for the responsibilities that came with full citizenship. The notion that a chicken thief could graduate to a sheep thief played into these racist stereotypes, reinforcing the belief that freedmen were not only unfit for citizenship, but also driven by a desire for excess. A chicken might provide sustenance for a starving family, but stealing a sheep, a more valuable and substantial source of food, was portrayed as an act of indulgence rather than necessity. To white Democrats, this suggested that black people lacked the self-restraint necessary to function as responsible citizens. The idea that a freedman might impulsively steal a chicken simply because it was within reach further cemented the belief that black individuals were incapable of controlling their base instincts. Such racist ideology fueled widespread hostility against the freedmen throughout the South. By the mid-1880s, nearly every Southern state had incorporated provisions into their disfranchisement laws that specifically targeted petty property crimes, using these laws as tools to suppress the political power of the black community. These laws were crafted not just to punish criminal behavior, but to perpetuate the belief that black people were inherently inferior and thus unworthy of the rights and privileges of citizenship. This narrative of black criminality served to justify the ongoing oppression and marginalization of the black population, ensuring that the legacy of slavery would continue to shape the social and political landscape of the South well into the 20th century. In 1938, Mamie Collins of Marion, South Carolina, recounted her great-grandfather's experiences in the aftermath of the Civil War when his enslaved people were set free. Her great-grandfather had once been a prosperous man owning 200 enslaved individuals, 43 plow teams, and 2,000 acres of land, a fortune built on the institution of chattel slavery. However, the end of the war and the Union's emancipation of enslaved people stripped him of his wealth and status. Collins described how her great-grandfather, left with a barrel full of worthless Confederate currency, died a broken-hearted man, his way of life irreparably destroyed by the abolishment of slavery. Collins herself lived on land inherited from her great-grandfather, maintaining a modest farm with a flock of chickens and a herd of pigs. However, she expressed fear and resentment toward her black neighbors, accusing them of stealing her pig the last time she let it roam freely. This sentiment, rooted in the era's pervasive racism, reflected the broader context in which the pig laws were enacted, laws designed to criminalize and control the newly freed black population, while the pig laws effectively filled Southern jails and penitentiaries with freedmen, forcing them into involuntary servitude and stripping them of their voting rights. The vagrancy laws played a significant role in augmenting these efforts. These laws, like the pig laws, were tools of oppression, designed to maintain white supremacy in the post-Civil War South by criminalizing the very existence of black people who were no longer enslaved. They were part of a larger system of legal and extra-legal measures intended to subjugate the black population, ensuring that even in freedom, they remained under the control of their former oppressors. Chapter 2. The Vagrancy Trap. Any freedman who fell within the vague and racially targeted definition of a vagrant could be arrested by a constable or police officer based on a mere complaint or even on the officer's initiative. Once apprehended, the individual was brought before a justice of the peace or magistrate. If convicted, the so-called vagrant could be sentenced to labor in various forms, including on farms, in houses of correction, workhouses, or common jails for a term ranging from 30 days to 6 months. However, this sentencing often did not apply to those who merely sought shelter or refused to work, leading to prolonged detention well beyond the stated 6-month limit. The core of these laws was clear. Forced labor was the intended outcome, with vagrants being sent to workhouses, correctional facilities, jails, or prisons. On January 15, 1866, Virginia passed an act specifically designed to address what was perceived as a growing problem of idle and disorderly individuals within the state. This act was largely aimed at the freedmen, who were seen as a potential burden to society. It was feared that the state would be overwhelmed by dissolute and abandoned freedmen, and many believed that stringent vagrancy laws would prevent such an outcome by curbing idleness and vagrancy. Under Virginia's 1866 vagrancy law, any person deemed a vagrant could be sentenced to a term not exceeding 3 months. During this time, the state had the authority to hire out the vagrant's labor for the highest possible wages. If the vagrant attempted to escape from their assigned employer, they would be captured on a warrant and immediately returned. In such cases, the employer was entitled to an additional month of the vagrant's labor without any compensation to the vagrant, effectively extending the period of forced labor as punishment for attempting to flee. This system of vagrancy laws served as a means to maintain control over the newly freed African American population, ensuring that, even in their supposed freedom, they remained bound by a legal framework that perpetuated their exploitation and subjugation. The laws were a clear continuation of the oppressive systems of slavery, repackaged under the guise of maintaining public order and preventing idleness. The legal framework surrounding vagrancy in the post-Civil War South was not merely punitive, but explicitly designed to reassert control over freed African Americans through a system that closely mirrored the conditions of slavery. Under these vagrancy laws, if a vagrant attempted to escape, the employer was authorized, upon obtaining the approval of a justice, to confine the individual with a ball and chain to prevent future attempts at fleeing. This brutal measure was intended to ensure that the freedmen, who were now ostensibly free citizens, remained subjugated and tethered to their former conditions of forced labor. In instances where an employer refused to take back a runaway vagrant, the law provided for the individual to be handed over to a workhouse overseer or superintendent upon the order of a justice. In this setting, the vagrant would be compelled to work for the benefit of the county or corporation that had custody of him. The same harsh punishment of being shackled with a ball and chain was applied in these circumstances to ensure compliance and to extract as much labor as possible from the individual. Furthermore, if there were ongoing public works in the county, the vagrant would be delivered to the superintendent overseeing such projects. Here, the vagrant would labor until the sentence imposed by the court was fulfilled. During this period, the individual would again be confined with a ball and chain, a stark reminder of the physical and psychological chains that still bound African Americans even after the abolition of slavery. These laws effectively turned freedmen into a new class of indentured laborers, perpetuating their exploitation under the guise of legal punishment. The vagrancy laws, like the pig laws before them, were tools of systemic oppression that aimed to maintain the racial and economic hierarchies of the pre-war South. They ensured that African Americans remained a marginalized and economically disadvantaged population, despite the legal end of slavery. The use of ball and chain, a method once reserved for enslaved individuals, now served as a symbol of the enduring struggle for true freedom and equality in the face of laws designed to keep them in perpetual bondage. The 1866 vagrancy law in Virginia was structured to control and exploit the labor of freedmen under the guise of legal authority. In instances where workhouses or public work projects were unavailable, justices of the peace were empowered to assign vagrants to private individuals who could work them, often under harsh conditions, including the use of ball and chain. If no one was available to take charge of the vagrant, they were committed to county jails, where they faced the prospect of meager sustenance, limited to bread and water throughout their sentence. Virginia's law meticulously defined who could be considered a vagrant, essentially criminalizing a wide range of behaviors associated with poverty and lack of employment. The first category included those who had been removed from a county or corporation and returned without permission, a scenario commonly dealt with by banishment practices aimed at reducing the visible presence of the impoverished and displaced. Communities often sought to rid themselves of vagrants by forcibly sending them away, only to be alarmed by their return. The second category of vagrancy was aimed at those who were unemployed and unable to support themselves or their families, particularly those who refused to work for the wages set by employers. This provision effectively placed the power to determine a freedman's economic survival in the hands of the employer, who could legally offer wages so low that they were exploitative. If the freedmen refused such terms, they risked being labeled a vagrant, subject to the law's severe penalties. The third category targeted those who declined to perform tasks as directed by overseers of the poor, further entrenching the power of employers and authorities over the freedmen. This clause meant that any work deemed necessary by the overseer had to be performed, regardless of its fairness or appropriateness. Failure to comply led to immediate classification as a vagrant. Lastly, the fourth category criminalized begging or soliciting aid, making it illegal for freedmen to seek assistance, a common recourse for those struggling to survive in the post-war South. This aspect of the law was particularly cruel, as it targeted the most vulnerable individuals, forcing them into a cycle of criminalization and exploitation. These vagrancy laws were part of a broader system designed to suppress and control the newly freed African American population, ensuring that their liberation from slavery did not translate into true freedom or economic independence. Instead, they were trapped in a legal framework that perpetuated their subjugation, mirroring the conditions of their former enslavement under the guise of lawful governance. The fourth provision of Virginia's Vagrancy Act was particularly insidious, targeting those who wandered and begged for help unless they were physically disabled and incapable of work. This clause was especially significant given the circumstances of newly freed slaves who, after emancipation, often traveled in search of family members and friends who had been sold off to other plantations. The ability to move freely was not just a fundamental right for the freedmen, it was also a means of liberation. Mobility allowed them to escape oppressive labor contracts, seek better opportunities, and, most importantly, reconnect with loved ones separated by the brutal slave trade. However, the freedom to move and seek a better life was precisely what the vagrancy laws sought to restrict. The fifth description of vagrancy was even more encompassing, declaring that anyone found loitering without work, trade, or a means of subsistence and unable to provide a reasonable account of themselves would be in violation of the law. This provision essentially criminalized the existence of freedmen who, after generations of enslavement, were left without resources, employment, or stable living conditions. This final clause of the vagrancy law was devastating in its impact, as it effectively categorized the vast majority of newly emancipated African Americans as vagrants. These individuals, having just been freed from slavery, were often left destitute, without property, employment, or the means to support themselves and their families. The law was structured in such a way that it perpetuated their subjugation under a different name, making it nearly impossible for them to exercise their newly won freedom. The enforcement of these laws was not just about maintaining public order. It was a deliberate strategy to re-enslave African Americans under the guise of legality. The cost of incarcerating and maintaining vagrants was often offset by hiring them out to employers, a practice that closely mirrored the conditions of slavery. Any shortfall in covering these costs was to be borne by the county or corporation, further entrenching the economic exploitation of African Americans. In essence, these provisions of the vagrancy laws were designed to ensure that freedmen remained economically and socially oppressed, despite their formal emancipation. The legal framework put in place by these laws served to strip African Americans of their autonomy, forcing them into labor contracts that benefited white landowners and employers, while simultaneously criminalizing their efforts to seek better opportunities or reunite with their families. The vagrancy laws, therefore, were a critical tool in the South's attempt to preserve the racial hierarchy that had been the cornerstone of slavery. Virginia's vagrancy law, enacted on January 15, 1866, was swiftly put into action, reflecting a broader pattern seen across the Southern states in the aftermath of the Civil War. Following Virginia's lead, Alabama also established and expanded its vagrancy statutes, which became a cornerstone of the Black Codes. Although these laws rarely, if ever, explicitly mention race, their enforcement was almost exclusively directed at the newly freed African Americans and their descendants. The language and intent behind these vagrancy laws were strikingly similar across the Southern states that adopted them. In Alabama, for instance, a vagrant was broadly defined as someone who wanders or strolls about in idleness or lives in idleness, who can work and has no property sufficient for his support. This vague description allowed for the wide-reaching application of the law, disproportionately targeting African Americans who were struggling to establish themselves in the new social and economic landscape. These vagrancy laws were not just about maintaining public order. They were deliberately crafted to control and exploit the Black population. By criminalizing behaviors associated with poverty and unemployment, the laws facilitated the recruitment and retention of Black labor under conditions that closely resembled slavery. The enforcement of these laws ensured a steady supply of cheap labor for white landowners and employers, who could then hire vagrants to work under oppressive conditions, often with little or no pay. In this way, the vagrancy laws served as a mechanism to perpetuate the economic and social subjugation of African Americans, ensuring that their newfound freedom remained largely nominal. By criminalizing their very existence in the public sphere, these laws effectively re-enslaved African Americans, binding them to a system that sought to exploit their labor while denying them the rights and privileges of citizenship. Enticement laws were designed to enforce the property claims of white contractors who held freedmen under labor contracts, ensuring that the newly freed African Americans remained bound to their employers for the full term of their agreements. These laws made it illegal for anyone to hire a freedman who was already under contract, thus locking the freedman into his original labor arrangement without the possibility of seeking better opportunities elsewhere. Anti-migrant agent laws further reinforced this system by imposing prohibitive license fees on individuals who made their living by relocating laborers from one state to another. These fees were deliberately set at levels that made it nearly impossible for migrant agents to operate, effectively stifling the movement of African American laborers across state lines. This restricted mobility ensured that freedmen could not escape the oppressive labor conditions imposed by their contracts. Together, these enticement and anti-migrant agent laws, along with an assortment of enforced contract laws, created a legal framework that closely resembled peonage, a system where freedmen were tied to their employers through debt and legal obligations, effectively re-enslaving them under the guise of contractual agreements. These laws were instrumental in maintaining the economic exploitation and social control of African Americans in the post-Civil War South, ensuring that the promise of freedom remained largely unfulfilled for many. The vagrancy laws were so insidiously broad that they effectively granted police officers the unchecked power to target any newly freed slave or their descendants, arresting them under the vague pretext of violating vagrancy statutes. These laws became weapons in the hands of employers who wielded them to coerce freedmen into submission, forcing them to accept whatever harsh demands their overseers imposed, all while enduring brutal working conditions. For those arrested and jailed under these vagrancy charges, the ordeal didn't end with imprisonment. They found themselves ensnared in the relentless machinery of the criminal surety system, where their freedom was dangled as a cruel bargaining chip. The system offered a bitter choice: sign a so-called voluntary labor contract with their former enslaver, or any white man willing to post bail, effectively re-enslaving themselves under the guise of legal compliance. This perverse legal structure, draped in the thin veil of law and order, was nothing more than a continuation of bondage by another name, a legal means to shackle the freedmen once more, tethering their freedom to the whims of those who sought to keep them subjugated. The convict labor laws, ironically, did not extend to the surety system, creating a glaring loophole that many employers eagerly exploited. This oversight in the law allowed them to bypass the restrictions intended to curb forced labor, making the surety system a convenient tool for perpetuating exploitation. Employers saw this as an opportunity to bind freedmen to harsh labor contracts under the pretense of legality. For those unfortunate vagrants who couldn't secure a surety, the alternative was even more grim. They were thrust into the brutal world of state-run chain gangs, where they endured the horrors of involuntary servitude. Stripped of their freedom and dignity, these individuals were forced to work in conditions that starkly mirrored the very slavery they had been promised escape from. The system was designed to break their spirit, chaining them, both literally and figuratively, to a cycle of oppression that continued to thrive under the guise of legal enforcement. This was not just a miscarriage of justice, it was a calculated perpetuation of bondage, cleverly cloaked in the language of law, but rooted in the unyielding desire to keep African Americans in perpetual subjugation. Alabama's vagrancy law, a tool steeped in the machinery of oppression, explicitly dictated that any person, save for those who are blind or physically unable to perform manual labor, found wandering from place to place, begging for food or sustenance, whether within or outside their known residence, was in violation of the law. Such individuals were to be labeled as vagrants or tramps, inevitably leading to their arrest and forced into involuntary labor. The statute took an even harsher turn by defining a tramp as any person committing vagrant acts outside the county of their established residence, further tightening the noose around those who dared to move beyond their prescribed boundaries. Alabama's vagrancy laws didn't stop with adults. They extended their grasp to children under 16. If a child violated any state ordinance, municipal law, or even knowingly associated with vagrants, they too were deemed in violation of the vagrancy law, thus branded as vagrants themselves. This insidious legislation ensured that the cycle of oppression could begin at the earliest of ages, trapping the next generation in the same cycle of exploitation. At the heart of the Black Codes, vagrancy and enticement laws stood as pillars of a sinister agenda. They were meticulously crafted to reforge the chains of bondage, guiding the newly freed slave back into the clutches of the very system they had sought to escape. These laws didn't just control movement or behavior, they sought to resurrect the old order, steering the freedmen back to the plantation's grasp, back to the perils of involuntary servitude under the guise of legal compliance. It was a dark stratagem, a legal maneuver designed to reintroduce the slave to the slave master, reinforcing a racial hierarchy that the Civil War had supposedly dismantled. Alabama's vagrancy law cast a wide and unforgiving net, particularly aimed at entrapping the children of freedmen. This section of the law was disturbingly explicit. Any child under the age of 16 who knowingly associated with a vagrant was, by the very terms of the law, branded a vagrant themselves. This draconian provision meant that the offspring of a vagrant were automatically deemed vagrants by law, making them vulnerable to arrest and forced into labor contracts, regardless of their innocence or intent. But the law's reach didn't stop there. It further stipulated that any child under 16 deemed to have insufficient guardianship or control would be considered a ward of the state. This classification effectively stripped parents, particularly freedmen, of their rights and authority over their children, placing those children directly under state control. The implications were chilling. By branding these children as vagrants, the state could legally funnel them into a system of forced labor, perpetuating a cycle of exploitation and servitude that targeted the most vulnerable. This law wasn't just about maintaining order, it was a calculated strategy to reinforce the racial hierarchy, ensuring that the children of freedmen would remain ensnared in the same oppressive structures that had shackled their parents. By wielding the law as a weapon, the state sought to undermine the autonomy of freedmen families, effectively reintroducing a form of slavery under the guise of legal enforcement. Once a child was taken into custody under Alabama's vagrancy law, they were subjected to the harsh reality of a binding labor contract, a mechanism that effectively shattered the freedman's family. Both father and child would be bound to conditions that mirrored the very slavery from which they had recently been liberated. The vagrancy law extended its reach even further, declaring that a child could be deemed a vagrant if their parents, struggling under the weight of newfound freedom, failed to provide a suitable home or means of securing an honest living. Given the dire circumstances many freedmen faced, it was all too easy for the state to classify them and their children as vagrants, ensnaring them in a system designed to strip away their autonomy. Alabama's Black Code laws were meticulously crafted to disenfranchise freedmen, reducing them to little more than manual laborers in a society that sought to reassert its control over them. The state decreed that any servant deemed stubborn and refractory who loitered away their time was in violation of the vagrancy law and would be fined $50. If the freedmen could not pay this fine, they would be hired out at a public auction for a 6-month period, essentially selling their labor to the highest bidder. This was in addition to the period they were already bound by a manual labor contract with an overseer. Once the 6-month auction period was satisfied, the freedman was required to return to the overseer to complete the remainder of their original labor contract. This legal provision handed overseers an additional 6 months of labor, often exploited to their full advantage. The freedman, therefore, was locked into a perpetual cycle of labor and subjugation, trapped within the far-reaching network of overlapping Black Code laws that kept them in a state of de facto slavery. Alabama's Black Codes were more than just laws. They were a calculated effort to preserve the economic and social order of slavery, even in the face of the 13th Amendment. These laws ensured that the auction block would remain, ever enduring, a chilling reminder that the shackles of slavery had not been entirely cast off. The freedmen were ensnared in a system that, despite the legal language of freedom, kept them bound to the same chains they had fought so hard to break. Florida's and Louisiana's vagrancy laws stood as close rivals to Alabama's notorious legislation, each crafted with the same ruthless precision to target the vulnerable. In Florida, the definition of a vagrant was deliberately broad, casting a wide net to ensnare anyone deemed idle, dissolute, or found begging. The statute also lumped together common night walkers, thieves, and those who neglected their calling or employment, branding them all as vagrants. Under this law, anyone without continuous employment or regular income, or lacking sufficient property to sustain themselves, was similarly classified as a vagrant. Florida's statute went further, declaring anyone a vagrant if they failed to adequately provide for and support their families. Even wandering from place to place without a lawful reason or cause was enough to violate the vagrancy law. The law painted with broad strokes, defining a vagrant as any able-bodied male over the age of 18 who was without employment and lived in idleness. This sweeping categorization of vagrancy wasn't just a legal definition. It was a weapon, a tool used to control and oppress. By criminalizing basic human conditions, poverty, unemployment, the struggle to make ends meet, Florida's vagrancy laws, like those in Alabama and Louisiana, ensured that the marginalized could be easily targeted, arrested, and forced into labor. These laws were designed to perpetuate a cycle of exploitation, keeping the newly freed and the economically disadvantaged bound to a system that sought to undermine their every step toward independence and equality. This legal framework wasn't about maintaining public order, it was about maintaining a social order, one that kept African Americans and the poor in a state of perpetual subservience, ever vulnerable to the whims of those who wielded power. By defining vagrancy so broadly, the state ensured that nearly anyone could be ensnared in its trap, further entrenching the racial and economic hierarchies that had long dominated Southern society. Florida's vagrancy law was particularly ruthless in its treatment of children, designating them as vagrants under a host of circumstances that criminalized their very existence. If a child was destitute, homeless, or even simply offering something for sale, they could be labeled a vagrant. The law extended its reach further, deeming any child who lived in an unfit home as a vagrant, regardless of their ability to control their circumstances. The law's grasp didn't stop there. It also targeted children who played a musical instrument, sang, or entertained the public in exchange for money or any form of compensation. Even these innocent acts, often born out of necessity, were enough to classify a child as a vagrant. A child under the age of 17 could also be branded a vagrant if they were found associating with criminals or if they were perceived to be growing up in idleness, another subjective and broadly defined criterion. Moreover, a child could be in direct violation of the vagrancy law if they violated any state law, city ordinance, or town regulation. This meant that nearly any minor infraction could result in a child being swept into the system, labeled a vagrant, and subjected to the harsh penalties that followed. These laws weren't merely about maintaining public order, they were mechanisms of control designed to keep vulnerable children, especially those of African American descent, under the thumb of a legal system that sought to suppress their potential and perpetuate a cycle of poverty and subjugation. By casting such a wide net, Florida's vagrancy laws ensured that countless children could be criminalized for circumstances beyond their control, effectively trapping them in a life of legal persecution and forced labor. This wasn't justice. It was systemic oppression, cloaked in the guise of law, aimed at maintaining a rigid social hierarchy that placed African Americans and the poor at the bottom. In the state of Florida, the law was a weapon of oppression, making it illegal for a freedman or any person of color to own, use, or keep a Bowie knife, sword, firearm, or ammunition without a license. The process of obtaining such a license was intentionally designed to be nearly impossible for African Americans, as it required the recommendation of 2 white men, a near insurmountable barrier in an era steeped in racial prejudice and hostility. This legal stipulation was less about public safety and more about ensuring that freedmen remained powerless and unable to defend themselves. If a freedman was found in violation of this draconian law, the punishment was as brutal as it was public. The individual would be forced to stand in a pillory, a humiliating form of punishment, for 1 hour, exposed to the scorn and derision of the community. But the ordeal did not end there. After enduring the pillory, the freedman would be whipped with 39 lashes upon his bare back, a savage reminder of the physical and psychological control that the state sought to maintain over African Americans. Southern states like Florida extended this systemic oppression further by deeming it unlawful for a freedman or any person of color to practice art, trade, or business as an artisan or shopkeeper. The law effectively barred African Americans from any form of economic independence, restricting them to roles as voluntary or involuntary servants, bound by the iron grip of contract labor. This legal framework wasn't just about limiting economic opportunities, it was about stripping away any semblance of agency, ensuring that African Americans remained chained to the bottom rung of society, their lives dictated by the whims of those who sought to keep them in perpetual servitude. These laws were not just remnants of a bygone era, they were the very tools that kept the structures of slavery alive, rebranded under the guise of legal governance. By criminalizing self-defense and economic independence, the state of Florida, along with other southern states, systematically dismantled the freedoms that African Americans had fought so hard to gain. This wasn't merely about maintaining order, it was about maintaining a racial hierarchy that ensured African Americans remained subjugated, powerless, and wholly dependent on the very society that had enslaved them. On December 20th, 1865, both houses of the Louisiana legislature passed, and the governor approved, a vagrancy law that closely mirrored the acts of 1855, embedding a legal framework aimed at controlling and subjugating the newly freed African American population. The law defined vagrants as all idle persons who lacked visible means of supporting themselves and who lived without employment. The law cast a wide net, encompassing anyone found wandering and lodging in groceries, taverns, sheds, barns, uninhabited buildings, or public spaces, labeling them as vagrants. Additionally, those who begged from door to door in streets or public places, or who abandoned, neglected, or failed to support their families were also deemed vagrants. Louisiana's vagrancy law, though enacted in the South, bore a striking resemblance to similar laws in the northern states, such as those in Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, and Maine. Once a freedman was convicted of vagrancy under this law, he faced severe punishment. He could be detained and hired out for a period not exceeding 12 months, or be committed to labor on public works, roads, and levees, essentially transforming a legal sentence into a tool for forced labor. Proponents of Louisiana's vagrancy law argued that such measures were essential for maintaining order in the southern states, claiming that the newly freed slaves were flooding the country with idleness and criminality. This rhetoric masked the true intent of the law: to control the freedmen, to keep them in a state of economic dependency, and to continue exploiting their labor under a legal guise. The law was more than a mere regulation. It was a continuation of the systemic oppression that had defined the antebellum South, repackaged in the post-emancipation era to reassert control over a population that had fought so hard for its freedom. By adopting a legal framework nearly identical to that of Massachusetts and other northern states, Louisiana's vagrancy law highlighted a disturbing national trend, one where both North and South found common ground in using the law to suppress African American freedom. These laws were not about addressing genuine social concerns, they were about preserving a social order built on racial subjugation. The vagrancy laws, whether in the North or South, served as tools to perpetuate a cycle of exploitation, ensuring that the newly freed remained bound to the very systems of oppression that they had only recently escaped. South Carolina's vagrancy law was a reflection of the broader network of black code laws that permeated the southern states, mirroring the precise language and intent of its neighboring counterparts. The law cast a wide and indiscriminate net, defining a vagrant as any person wandering from place to place without a known residence, or anyone living within a city, county, or town who lacked sufficient means to secure a fair and reputable livelihood. This vague and sweeping definition was designed to target those who had only recently been freed, ensuring they remained tethered to the constraints of an oppressive legal system. The law went further, describing a vagrant as anyone who led an idle life or possessed a plot of uncultivated land that a magistrate deemed necessary for their maintenance. In other words, simply owning land that wasn't actively farmed could render one in violation of the law, opening the door for legal persecution and forced labor. The restrictions didn't end there. A person was also considered in violation of South Carolina's vagrancy law if they performed in a play, tragedy, interlude, or farce, or engaged in any form of entertainment without a license. This clause effectively criminalized the pursuit of artistic and cultural expressions, further limiting the avenues through which freedmen could seek livelihoods or express their newfound freedom. South Carolina's vagrancy law, like those of other southern states, wasn't merely about regulating public behavior. It was a tool of control designed to keep African Americans in a state of dependency and vulnerability. By criminalizing idleness, uncultivated land, and unlicensed performance, the law ensured that freedmen remained under the constant threat of legal action, their freedom curtailed by the very system that was supposed to protect it. This legal framework wasn't just about maintaining order, it was about maintaining a social hierarchy that continued to privilege white citizens while systematically undermining the rights and autonomy of African Americans. Mississippi's vagrancy law of 1865 was a calculated instrument of oppression, designed to tighten the grip of control over the newly freed African American population. The law decreed that all able-bodied persons who habitually loitered or idled in cities, towns, villages, near steamboat landings, railroad stations, or any public place in the state would be deemed vagrants. The precise wording of this law was not incidental, it was deliberate. It effectively made it illegal for a freedman to appear in virtually any public space across the state, turning the very act of existing in these areas into a criminal offense. The implications of this were severe. The latter part of Mississippi's vagrancy law effectively barred persons of color from utilizing the primary modes of transportation within the state, boats and trains, by criminalizing their presence near these critical infrastructures. This was not just a restriction on movement, it was an assault on the very possibility of mobility and economic opportunity for African Americans, trapping them in a cycle of immobility and poverty. For those arrested and convicted of violating this draconian law, the consequences were harsh. A first-time offender would be confined for no less than 10 days, but no more than 30 days. A second offense resulted in confinement of no less than 30 days and up to 6 months. Adding to the cruelty, all costs associated with the arrest and incarceration of vagrants were to be borne by the convicted individuals themselves. Failure to pay these costs would result in an extended prison stay, further entrenching the cycle of punishment and exploitation. While in state custody, these vagrants were subjected to contract labor, an insidious form of involuntary servitude that was nothing short of slavery under a different name. Mississippi's black codes didn't just aim to restrict the freedoms of African Americans, they sought to re-enslave them under the guise of legal enforcement. Among the many penalties outlined in these black codes, the punishment for interracial marriage was perhaps the most extreme. In Mississippi, if a white person and a black person chose to marry, they were committing a crime punishable by life imprisonment in the penitentiary. This draconian measure underscored the lengths to which the state would go to preserve racial purity and white supremacy, using the full weight of the law to enforce the separation and subjugation of African Americans. Mississippi's vagrancy law, like those of other southern states, was a weapon of racial control designed to strip newly freed slaves of their rights, their dignity, and their very humanity. By criminalizing everyday activities and relationships, these laws sought to reestablish the racial order that had been momentarily disrupted by emancipation, ensuring that African Americans remained locked in a system of oppression that was all too familiar. Mississippi's 1866 Vagrancy Act was a stark embodiment of the oppressive measures used to maintain control over African Americans in the post-Civil War South. The act stated that all freedmen, people of color, and mulattoes over the age of 18 who were found without lawful employment after the second Monday of January would be deemed vagrants. This provision was a clear attempt to criminalize unemployment among African Americans, ensuring that they remained bound to labor under conditions not far removed from slavery. The act further tightened its grip by criminalizing any unlawful assembly of freedmen during the day or night, and shockingly, by prohibiting any assembly of freedmen with white people under the pretense of equality. This provision was designed to reinforce racial hierarchies, making it illegal for African Americans to engage with whites as equals, thus perpetuating the social order that had been momentarily disrupted by emancipation. The Vagrancy Act didn't just target African Americans, it also extended its punitive reach to white men who lived in adultery or fornicated with black women. These men were deemed vagrants as well and were subjected to a fine of $50. The act revealed its true nature when it stipulated that if a convicted person could not pay the fine within 5 days, the sheriff was authorized to hire out the convict to generate currency equivalent to the amount of the fine. This practice was a thinly veiled continuation of slavery, allowing the state to profit from the forced labor of those who could not afford to pay their fines. The hiring out of convicts ensured that African Americans, and even the white men who associated with them, remained under the control of the same system of exploitation that had defined their lives before the Civil War. Mississippi's 1866 Vagrancy Act was not merely a law, it was a mechanism of oppression meticulously designed to reassert white supremacy and maintain the subjugation of African Americans. By criminalizing unemployment, assembly, and interracial relationships, the state sought to trap African Americans in a cycle of poverty, punishment, and forced labor, ensuring that the promise of freedom remained out of reach. The vagrancy laws of the South were devastatingly effective in re-enslaving newly freed African Americans, trapping them in a cruel cycle that mirrored the very conditions from which they had only just been liberated. These laws severely restricted their movement, making it nearly impossible for them to exist freely within society. Those who were caught in violation of these laws were subjected to brutal punishments, whipped, held in captivity, and forced into grueling labor under the inhumane convict leasing system. Under the pretense of maintaining order, these laws allowed the state to criminalize basic acts of survival, such as seeking employment or merely existing in public spaces. Once convicted, African Americans were leased out to private enterprises, where they endured harsh, dehumanizing conditions that were indistinguishable from the brutality of slavery. This system was not just a legal formality, it was a calculated strategy to ensure that the economic and social order of the antebellum South persisted despite the legal abolition of slavery. Through vagrancy laws, the South effectively reestablished a system of forced labor and racial control, ensuring that the promise of freedom remained a distant dream for many African Americans. These laws were a stark reminder that the end of slavery was not the end of oppression, it was merely the beginning of a new chapter in the long struggle for true freedom and equality. Chapter 3, Shackles of Convict Leasing System. I think God intended the niggers to be slaves. Now, since man has deranged God's plan, I think the best we can do is keep them as near to a state of bondage as possible. My theory is feed them well, clothe them well, and then, if they don't work, whip them well. The sentiment expressed in the quote, a chilling reflection of the pervasive racism of the era, underscores the deep-seated belief among many Southern whites that African Americans were inherently criminal and should be kept as close to slavery as possible, even after emancipation. At the conclusion of the American Civil War, Southern planters, stripped of their legal right to own slaves, sought new ways to control and exploit black labor. The abolition of slavery had dismantled the formal institution of bondage, but the mindset that underpinned it remained deeply entrenched. In the postbellum South, the association of criminal behavior with the black race became a widespread and dangerous stereotype. Southern whites often viewed African Americans as inherently prone to criminality, a belief that fueled efforts to reassert control over the freedmen through oppressive laws and practices. With the end of slavery, the so-called black crime shifted from the confines of the plantation to the broader society as former slaves, now free but destitute, struggled to survive. Stealing food became one of the most common offenses attributed to the freedmen, with pigs, turkeys, chickens, melons, and ears of corn frequently reported as stolen goods. These acts of desperation were not merely crimes, they were a reflection of the extreme poverty and hunger that plagued the newly freed African American population. In 1866, a Mississippi woman wrote of the freedmen as a destitute people, predicting that they would continue to steal as a means of survival. Military Commander General Ord echoed this sentiment, noting that the freedmen were plundering for food. These views were used to justify the harsh treatment and continued subjugation of African Americans in the South. The criminalization of black poverty and the assumption that African Americans were naturally inclined to theft and other crimes were integral to the oppressive systems that emerged after the Civil War. Through vagrancy laws, black codes, and the convict leasing system, Southern whites sought to reestablish a social and economic order that kept African Americans in a state of near slavery, bound by the chains of legal and extra-legal oppression. Edmund Richardson, a wealthy former slave owner from North Carolina, epitomized the ruthless exploitation that emerged in the South after the Civil War. Born on July 28, 1818, Richardson had transformed his modest inheritance of $2,800 and a few slaves into a vast empire of general stores and cotton plantations across Mississippi. By the early stages of the Civil War, Richardson's assets had ballooned to an impressive $1 million. However, by the war's end, he had lost nearly everything he had painstakingly built. Faced with the daunting task of rebuilding his fortune, Richardson turned to the devastated lands of the Yazoo Delta, where he needed cheap labor to restore and cultivate his plantations. The state of Mississippi, grappling with a penitentiary overrun with former slaves as a direct consequence of black code law convictions, saw an opportunity in Richardson's predicament. State officials struck a deal with Richardson, contracting the felons, freedmen now imprisoned under the harsh vagrancy laws, to provide the labor he desperately needed. Under the terms of the agreement, Richardson pledged to feed, clothe, and treat the contracted freedmen well. In exchange, the state agreed to pay him $18,000 per year for the maintenance of the imprisoned laborers. However, the real windfall for Richardson lay in the profits he was allowed to keep from the labor of these convicted freedmen. The state's payment covered only their basic needs, while Richardson retained the full sum of all profits generated by their work. This arrangement was emblematic of the larger system of convict leasing that spread across the South during Reconstruction. It was a system designed to circumvent the abolition of slavery by legally binding African Americans to conditions that were barely distinguishable from the bondage they had endured before. Richardson, like many other former slave owners, capitalized on this system, rebuilding his wealth on the backs of the very people who had been promised freedom, but found themselves trapped once again in a life of exploitation and suffering. The deal with the state of Mississippi allowed Richardson to regain his footing, but it did so at the immense cost of the lives and labor of countless freedmen. This dark chapter in American history underscores the lengths to which Southern elites went to preserve their economic dominance and maintain the racial hierarchy that had been momentarily disrupted by the Civil War and emancipation. Edmund Richardson's convict leasing contract marked the grim beginning of an era in Mississippi that would see generations of African American prisoners endure unimaginable suffering. His agreement with the state not only ushered in the era of convict leasing, but also set a precedent that would shape the brutal landscape of the New South's economy. Under this system, an entire generation of black prisoners was subjected to conditions that many claim were even more harrowing than those experienced under slavery. Unlike in a traditional prison or county jail, freedmen rarely served their sentences within the walls of state institutions. Instead, they were sent to toil in coal mines, sawmills, railroads, chain gangs, and, most notably, on the cotton plantations of their former enslavers. This labor wasn't just a means of punishment. It became the backbone of the emerging New South's economy, fueling its growth at the expense of countless black lives. Richardson's contract with Mississippi effectively laid the groundwork for the convict leasing system that many others would soon adopt. His approach was as calculated as it was cruel. He segregated his convicts by race, keeping the few white prisoners in Jackson while sending the black convicts to the unforgiving conditions of the Delta farms. This racial division was starkly illustrated in the Penitentiary Report of 1871, which revealed that 152 convicted freedmen were sent to the Delta, while only 61 white male convicts remained within the confines of the penitentiary. The conditions on the Delta farms were primitive and brutal, with little regard for the well-being of the convicts. These black men, many of whom were sentenced under the harsh vagrancy laws that criminalized their very existence, found themselves in a new form of bondage. The labor they were forced to perform was grueling, the environment hostile, and the oversight minimal. The death toll was staggering, as the convicts were seen as expendable, a disposable workforce whose lives mattered little to those who profited from their suffering. Richardson's contract not only highlighted the racial inequalities that continued to plague the South, but also solidified the economic exploitation of African Americans under the guise of legal punishment. The convict leasing system became a cornerstone of the New South's economic strategy, ensuring that the legacy of slavery endured long after the Civil War had ended. The story of Richardson and the countless others who followed in his footsteps is a stark reminder of how deeply ingrained racial oppression was in the fabric of Southern society and how the fight for true freedom and equality was far from over. Richardson's black convict laborers were condemned to perform the most grueling and degrading tasks, euphemistically referred to as nigger work. These men were forced to build levees, clear swampland, and plow fields under the harshest conditions imaginable. Yet, the penitentiary report on Richardson's farm painted a deceitful picture of life on his plantation. The report falsely claimed that the convicts carried out the majority of their labor with cheerfulness and suggested that beatings, whippings, and other forms of capital punishment were rare if they occurred at all. However, the truth was far darker. The report frivolously mentioned that 1 in 19 convicted freedmen had escaped between 1868 and 1871, a statistic that spoke volumes about the desperation of those trapped within Richardson's brutal system. It also acknowledged, almost as an afterthought, that dozens of convicted freedmen had died, often due to a combination of gunshot wounds and disease. Despite these grim details, the report's revelations about the inhumane treatment of the convicts were met with a disturbingly muted response. Instead, what garnered significant attention and admiration was the vast success that Richardson had achieved through this brutal system. By 1880, Richardson had amassed a considerable fortune, thanks in large part to the convict lease system. He owned 2 opulent mansions, one in New Orleans and the other in Jackson, along with a sprawling plantation house called Refuge in the Yazoo Delta. His wealth and success were emblematic of a broader trend across the South, where businessmen like Richardson exploited the convict lease system to rebuild their fortunes on the backs of the newly freed, yet perpetually oppressed African Americans. The convict lease system was a thinly veiled continuation of slavery, allowing men like Richardson to capitalize on the forced labor of black convicts, all while maintaining the facade of legality. The system provided them with a steady supply of cheap labor, enabling them to rebuild the Southern economy on the same foundation of exploitation and racial subjugation that had sustained it before the Civil War. Richardson's wealth and the admiration it elicited served as a stark reminder of how deeply entrenched these systems of oppression remained, even as the South entered a new era. His story, and that of the countless convicts who suffered under his control, is a testament to the enduring legacy of slavery and the relentless pursuit of profit at the expense of human dignity. Edmund Richardson's empire extended far beyond the confines of agriculture, encompassing a vast array of assets that included banks, steamboats, and railroads. He owned 3 dozen cotton plantations and held a controlling interest in Mississippi Mills, the largest textile plant in the Lower South. Through the exploitative system of convict leasing, Richardson amassed a fortune that surpassed even that of many former slave masters, becoming a symbol of the South's economic resurgence built on the continued subjugation of African Americans. Richardson's wealth was staggering. His brokerage business, Richardson and May, handled over 250,000 bales of cotton annually, solidifying his position as a key figure in the Southern economy. The press lauded him as the greatest of Southern financiers, proudly proclaiming him the largest cotton planter in the world. Richardson, basking in this acclaim, portrayed himself as the darky's best friend, a term steeped in the condescension and racism of the era. He often recounted how his favorite slaves, given to him as a wedding gift in 1840, remained in his service as house servants even by 1880. According to Richardson, these former slaves, despite their emancipation, never desired to leave their happy conditions and stayed devoted to him, a narrative that conveniently ignored the coercive power dynamics at play. Richardson's self-aggrandizing claims were part of a broader effort to sanitize the brutal realities of the system that enriched him. By painting himself as a benevolent master, he sought to obscure the exploitation and suffering that underpinned his success. The convicts who labored under his control endured conditions that were often worse than slavery, yet Richardson framed his relationship with African Americans as one of mutual loyalty and affection. This narrative not only served to justify his actions, but also to perpetuate the myth of the happy slave, a pernicious lie that sought to minimize the horrors of both slavery and the convict leasing system. Richardson's story is a stark reminder of how wealth and power were built on the backs of African Americans, even after the formal abolition of slavery. His empire, hailed by the press and admired by his peers, was a monument to the persistence of racial exploitation in the South. While Richardson enjoyed the fruits of his empire, the lives of countless African Americans were reduced to a mere means to an end, their labor fueling the fortunes of men like him who were all too willing to profit from their suffering. The convict leasing system was a crucible of exploitation and conflict, where the interests of the rich clashed with those of the poor. Whites were pitted against blacks, and ex-masters found themselves in a perverse competition with their former slaves. The profits generated by this system, although vast, were jealously guarded and bitterly resented by those who saw little benefit from its cruel machinery. The economic and social dynamics it created deepened existing divisions and perpetuated the inequalities that had defined the South for generations. Amidst this turmoil, Black and white Republican leaders recognized the political utility of advocating for sustained and increased freedmen voting rights, which bolstered their political base and, by extension, their own power. However, the very system they operated within was rife with contradictions and moral compromises. In 1870, Governor James Alcorn publicly condemned the brutality he witnessed firsthand when he saw a group of convicts, shackled and lagged by armed guards, being marched under the watchful eyes of overseers. The overseers, wielding near absolute power, often responded to perceived insubordination or minor infractions with lethal force. Convicts were frequently shot dead or beaten severely, acts of violence carried out extra-legally and with impunity. Yet, despite his public admonishment and the indignation he expressed over the inhumane treatment of convicts, Governor Alcorn's actions soon revealed the complexity and perhaps the hypocrisy of his stance. Just a few months after his critique, Alcorn extended Richardson's convict leasing contract for an additional 2 years, effectively endorsing the very system he had denounced. This decision highlighted the deep entanglement of economic interests and political expediency in the South, where even those who recognized the system's brutality found themselves complicit in its perpetuation. Governor Alcorn's actions serve as a microcosm of the broader moral failings of the time. The convict leasing system, while publicly criticized for its excesses, continued to thrive because it was too profitable, too deeply embedded in the economic fabric of the South, to dismantle easily. The profits it generated, though narrowly shared among the elite, were enough to ensure its survival, even at the cost of human lives. The system's persistence underscored the harsh reality that, in the post-Civil War South, the drive for economic recovery and personal enrichment often outweighed any genuine commitment to justice or humanity. In this environment, the lines between former masters and former slaves blurred, as both were ensnared in a system that sought to exploit them for different ends. The rich profited, the poor suffered, and the racial and economic divisions that had defined the antebellum period were reasserted in a new, equally brutal form. The extension of Richardson's contract, despite the acknowledged brutality of the convict leasing system, was a stark reminder of how deeply entrenched these systems of exploitation were, and how difficult it would be to eradicate them. Before the war, we owned the Negroes. If a man had a good nigger, he could afford to take care of him. If he was sick, get a doctor. He might even put gold plugs in his teeth. But these convicts, we don't own them. One dies, get another. In the aftermath of the Civil War, more than 400,000 slaves were set free in Mississippi, yet the promise of freedom quickly became entangled in a web of oppressive practices designed to maintain control over the newly emancipated population. In towns where freedmen and whites shared roughly equivalent populations, the disparity in policing and incarceration was stark. Local officials disproportionately targeted African Americans, ensuring that the system of racial control remained firmly in place despite the abolition of slavery. In August 1866, for example, the local jail in Natchez housed a mere 9 white men, while a staggering 67 freedmen were incarcerated there, a clear reflection of the racially biased application of law enforcement. By November 1874 in Columbus, the situation was similarly dire, with 53 freedmen making up the entire population of the local jail. This pattern of disproportionate incarceration persisted throughout Mississippi. The register of the jail in Vicksburg, covering the period from March 1, 1886 to February 28, 1887, revealed that 426 freedmen were held there, compared to only 20 whites. The situation was no better within municipal workhouses during the same period, where 992 freedmen were incarcerated, compared to 442 whites. These numbers tell a chilling story of a system determined to reassert control over African Americans through legal and extra-legal means. The criminal justice system, particularly in the postbellum South, became a tool for perpetuating racial inequality. Freedmen, who should have been enjoying the liberties promised by emancipation, instead found themselves entangled in a justice system designed to criminalize their existence and strip them of their newfound freedom. The rampant over-policing and mass incarceration of African Americans in this period was not just about maintaining order. It was a calculated effort to continue the subjugation of a people who had fought so hard for their liberation. The disproportionate imprisonment rates served as a stark reminder that, despite the end of slavery, the fight for true equality and justice was far from over. The jails and workhouses of Mississippi became new sites of bondage, where the legacy of slavery persisted in the form of racialized incarceration. A considerable number of freedmen in the post-Civil War South found themselves under relentless scrutiny and unwavering policing by local authorities. The racial bias of the time meant that a freedman was far more likely to be arrested for minor offenses than his white counterparts. Once arrested, the reality for most freedmen was grim. Lacking the financial means to pay their jail fines, they were sentenced to time in jail, only to be leased out under labor agreements designed to extract their work under conditions that closely resembled slavery. This system extended beyond men. Black women, too, were subjected to the brutal indignities of chain gangs, forced to labor in public view. In many towns across the Black Belt, the sight of freedmen in chains became a disturbingly common image, one that reinforced and perpetuated racial stereotypes. The chain gang became synonymous with the freedmen, forging a racial character in the public consciousness that associated blackness with criminality and subservience. The racial distinction in the treatment of prisoners was stark. There was a widespread belief that no white person should be subjected to the demeaning conditions of a chain gang, which was seen as befitting only the low racial stock of the freedmen. On the rare occasions when a white person was included in a chain gang, it was considered an affront to white superiority. In these instances, the overseer responsible for the chain gang was often required to pay fines directly to the mayor, as if to atone for the breach of racial hierarchy. This racialized system of punishment served as a powerful tool of social control, reinforcing the racial order that had been disrupted by emancipation. The chain gangs were not just about punishing crime. They were about maintaining a social order that kept African Americans in a state of perpetual subjugation. By criminalizing minor offenses and leveraging the economic vulnerability of the freedmen, local authorities effectively reimposed a form of slavery, ensuring that the promise of freedom remained elusive for many African Americans in the South. For offenses that were not deemed severe enough to warrant a sentence greater than 1 year, or for those that merely breached a local ordinance, convicted individuals were typically sent to the county jail. Among these, nearly all the convicted freedmen were sentenced for petty larceny, crimes of survival rather than malice. However, the sheer number of arrests often overwhelmed the county jails, particularly as the police, driven by racial biases and the desire to exert control, rounded up more freedmen than the facilities could accommodate. In these instances, when the county jail reached capacity, an alternative punishment was meted out: public flogging at a whipping post. This brutal practice served as a grim reminder of the persistence of slavery-era methods of punishment, now repurposed to enforce the new social order. For minor offenses that might otherwise have resulted in a short jail sentence, freedmen were instead subjected to the public humiliation and physical torment of flogging, a clear indication that the justice system was designed not just to punish, but to degrade and dehumanize. The use of the whipping post as a substitute for incarceration was a calculated act of cruelty, intended to maintain the racial hierarchy by instilling fear and asserting dominance. It reinforced the notion that African Americans, even in their freedom, were still subject to the same forms of violence and control that had defined their lives under slavery. This practice was yet another tool in the arsenal of Southern authorities aimed at keeping the freedmen in a state of perpetual subjugation, where even the most minor infractions could result in brutal public punishment. In 1875, responding to mounting pressure from taxpayers, the Republican legislature in Mississippi passed a law allowing counties to lease their convicts to anyone willing to maintain them. This move marked a significant shift in the penal system, effectively commodifying convict labor and laying the groundwork for widespread exploitation. The following year, when Democrats regained control of the legislature, they expanded this law further. The boards of supervisors were granted broad authority to work or lease convicts in any manner they saw fit. This power was extended to city and town officials, ensuring that the practice of convict leasing became deeply entrenched in both rural and urban areas. By 1892, new legislation took this system to its logical extreme. The state adopted laws that mandated the transfer of convicts from counties that failed to make leasing arrangements with contractors. Under this law, employers and landlords were given preferential treatment when leasing convicts from the sheriff, further entrenching the exploitative nature of the system. Importantly, the consent of the convict was entirely unnecessary. The individual had no say in their forced labor arrangement, effectively rendering them powerless and at the mercy of their new masters. Throughout Mississippi, counties eagerly adopted this system of convict leasing, driven by the promise of profit and the continuation of racial subjugation. Individual contractors would lease convicts from the state, and in many cases, these contractors would sublease the laborers to other employers, creating a network of exploitation that mirrored the slave trade of the antebellum South. The result was a system where African Americans, though technically free, found themselves once again subjected to forced labor, their lives controlled by the same forces that had enslaved them before. This expansion of convict leasing laws not only perpetuated the economic exploitation of African Americans, but also reinforced the racial hierarchies that defined the South. The practice became a cornerstone of the post-Reconstruction economy, ensuring that the wealth and power remained concentrated in the hands of white elites, while African Americans were systematically denied the freedoms and opportunities that emancipation had promised. The treatment of convicts leased out under Mississippi's convict leasing system was notoriously harsh, often far worse than the conditions faced by those confined within state prisons. The system was designed not only to exploit the labor of these convicts, but also to maintain a social order that kept African Americans in a state of near slavery, even after the Civil War. The first Democratic legislature, after regaining power, passed a bill that drastically redefined theft laws to target African Americans. Under this new law, the theft of any property valued at more than $10, or any cattle or swine, regardless of actual value, was classified as grand larceny. This law, later infamously known as the Pig Law, ensured that even minor thefts could lead to severe penalties. Once convicted, freedmen faced sentences of up to 5 years in the state penitentiary. The true cruelty of this law lay in the provision that allowed these convicts to be legally leased out for the entirety of their sentence, with or without their consent. This meant that African Americans, convicted under the Pig Law, could be subjected to forced labor for years, often under conditions far more brutal than those in the penitentiary itself. The Pig Law was a driving force behind the rapid expansion of Mississippi's prison population. In 1877, the year following the passage of this law, the number of state prisoners skyrocketed from 272 to 1,072, a nearly fourfold increase. This surge in the prison population provided a steady supply of cheap labor, which was eagerly exploited by the state and private contractors alike. The convict leasing system, bolstered by laws like the Pig Law, effectively re-enslaved African Americans under the guise of legal punishment. The harsh treatment of leased-out convicts and the exploitative nature of the system reflected the deep-seated racial prejudices of the time, ensuring that the economic and social structures of the antebellum South persisted well into the post-Reconstruction era. The rapid increase in the prison population and the conditions under which these convicts labored were a stark reminder that, despite the formal end of slavery, the struggle for true freedom and equality was far from over. The Pig Law, when combined with the Vagrancy Law, transformed the convict lease system into a lucrative business enterprise in the post-Reconstruction South. This system of exploitation was not only financially rewarding for those involved, but also deeply entrenched in the economic and social fabric of the region. An official who closely examined the convict lease system described it as an enormously profitable institution, one that left behind a trail of dishonor and death comparable to the brutal persecutions of the Middle Ages. Under this system, convicts were frequently subleased to planters, speculators, and contractors working on railroads and levees. These men, driven by profit, subjected the convicts to inhumane conditions, keeping them in bulky portable cages or temporary enclosures on remote southern plantations. When hired out to work in the treacherous and isolated delta swamps, these makeshift cages became their prisons, places where they were held in captivity, far from any semblance of oversight or compassion. The convicts lived and labored under the absolute authority of their overseers, sub-lessees, and keepers who exercised near total control over their lives. This power dynamic, rooted in the racial hierarchies of the time, ensured that the convicts, who were predominantly African American, were treated with extreme cruelty and dehumanization. The brutal conditions they endured were exacerbated by the remote locations of these camps, which made it nearly impossible for outsiders to witness or challenge the atrocities being committed. The public's perception of freedmen as inherently inferior, combined with the isolation of these primitive convict camps, contributed to the delayed and muted protests against the convict leasing system. Society's deeply ingrained racial prejudices made it easier for people to overlook or justify the brutality inflicted upon the convicts, while the physical distance of the camps from public scrutiny allowed the system to operate with impunity. This silence and inaction enabled the convict lease system to persist, despite the widespread suffering it caused. The system was a direct continuation of the antebellum South's exploitation of African American labor, repackaged under the guise of legal punishment. The immense profitability of convict leasing, coupled with the pervasive racism of the era, ensured that the voices of those who might have spoken out were drowned in the pursuit of economic gain and the maintenance of social order. The result was a system that not only stripped African Americans of their freedom, but also perpetuated a cycle of violence and dehumanization that left a lasting scar on the history of the South. The convict leasing system was designed and maintained to specifically target freedmen, ensuring that the exploitation of African American labor continued even after the abolition of slavery. This system's racial exclusivity was a critical factor in its preservation and effectiveness. The fact that very few white men were sent to prison, and when they were, it was typically for grave crimes, further underscores the racial bias embedded in the system. Unlike their black counterparts, white convicts served their sentences within the relative safety of the prison walls, shielded from the brutal realities of convict leasing. Contractors who profited from the labor of convicts had no interest in or use for the scarce number of white men who found themselves incarcerated. The segregation of white and black convicts was strictly enforced, with contractors refusing to accept or promote the mixing of races within their labor forces. This segregation was not merely a matter of social custom, but a deliberate strategy to maintain the racial hierarchy that had defined Southern society. In the rare instances where white convicts were employed, they were often placed in positions of relative authority over their black peers. Some contractors used these few white convicts as straw bosses or junior supervisors, granting them a modicum of power and responsibility over the convicted freedmen. This practice reinforced the existing racial order, even within the convict labor camps, by ensuring that whites, no matter how marginalized, were placed in positions of dominance over blacks. Beyond their supervisory roles, these white convicts were sometimes tasked with limited clerical duties, further distancing them from the harsh physical labor that defined the daily lives of the freedmen in the system. This division of labor not only reflected but also reinforced the racial inequalities that the convict leasing system was built upon. It allowed the system to continue exploiting African American labor while maintaining the social distinctions that had been in place during slavery. The convict leasing system, therefore, was not just about punishment or profit. It was a means of preserving the racial caste system that had been disrupted by emancipation. By reserving the harshest treatment and most grueling labor for black convicts, while relegating white convicts to supervisory roles or clerical tasks, the system ensured that the power dynamics of the Old South remained intact. This racial exclusivity was key to the system's endurance, as it allowed the continuation of white supremacy under the guise of legal and economic necessity. The convict leasing system was, in essence, a mechanism designed almost exclusively for the exploitation of freedmen, perpetuating the racial hierarchy that had underpinned slavery. In April 1869, of the 364 convicts in Mississippi, 235 were freedmen who were leased out to work on levees and plantations, often ending up on the very same plantations owned by their former slave masters. In stark contrast, only 105 of these convicts were white, and they remained within the relative safety of the prison walls. By 1872, the disparity became even more pronounced, with only 6 white men working outside the prison, typically serving as supervisors over the freedmen or performing clerical duties. This segregation within the convict system underscored the racial exclusivity of the practice, ensuring that the harshest conditions and most grueling labor were reserved for African Americans. Governor Lowry's declaration that there was no public sentiment to protect convicts from the abuses they suffered highlighted the pervasive indifference to the plight of African Americans. Between 1880 and 1885, the statistics painted a grim picture, an average of 526 white convicts compared to 4,552 freedmen convicts. Of the white prison population during this period, only 28 died while in state custody. In stark contrast, 492 freedmen, nearly the total number of white convicts, died during the same period. The death toll among freedmen was not merely a statistic. It was a testament to the brutal conditions they endured, conditions that often proved fatal. The treatment of these convicts was nothing short of barbaric. Many were subjected to such harsh conditions that they were left disabled or even killed. In 1884, a particularly egregious incident in Vicksburg brought this cruelty to public attention. 18 convicts left the prison in good health but returned maimed or severely disabled. These men had been exposed to the unforgiving winter without adequate clothing, making them vulnerable to frostbite. They also suffered relentless beatings at the hands of their overseers, who wielded near absolute power over them. The publication of this incident in a local newspaper prompted state officials to launch an investigation, but the effort was short-lived. A powerful lobbying group, likely representing the interests of those who profited from the convict leasing system, successfully halted the investigation, ensuring that the abuses would continue unchecked. This incident, and the broader system it exemplified, revealed the deep-seated corruption and racial injustice that defined the post-Civil War South. The convict leasing system was not just an economic enterprise. It was a continuation of the racial subjugation that had existed under slavery, repackaged under the guise of legal punishment. The overwhelming disparity in the treatment of white and black convicts, the shocking death toll among freedmen, and the brutal conditions they endured all underscored the extent to which the system was designed to oppress African Americans and perpetuate their exploitation long after the abolition of slavery. In 1887, the grand jury of Hinds County conducted an inspection of a state prison and uncovered harrowing evidence of the brutality inflicted upon convicts leased out to work on farms and railroads. Upon their return to the prison's hospital, 26 convicts were found to be suffering from incurable diseases and consumption, their bodies bearing the unmistakable marks of severe and inhumane treatment. The jurors were horrified to find that many of these convicts had backs lacerated with great wales, riddled with scars and blisters, a testament to the relentless and prolonged beatings they had endured. The abuse had been so extreme that in some cases, the convict's skin had peeled off in pieces, a result of the unyielding and savage punishment. Many of these individuals also bore the painful consequences of frostbite on their hands and feet, a result of being exposed to harsh conditions without adequate protection. The grand jury's inspection revealed an appalling scene in the prison hospital, where these convicts were left to die, lying on bare boards in such poor conditions that their bones nearly protruded through their skin. The convicts, already weakened by the harsh conditions and brutal treatment, complained of hunger, as they were provided with insufficient food. The jury noted the presence of live vermin crawling over the faces of the suffering convicts, adding to the unspeakable misery they endured. Furthermore, the convicts had been provided with inadequate clothing and bedspreads, which had become stiff and inflexible due to an accumulation of filth. The grand juror's report painted a grim picture of the neglect and cruelty that defined the lives of these convicts, exposing the horrific reality of the convict leasing system. This inspection not only highlighted the extreme physical suffering imposed on these individuals, but also underscored the systemic disregard for their humanity. The conditions described by the grand jury were a stark indictment of a system that prioritized profit over human dignity, reducing the lives of these convicts to little more than a commodity to be exploited until they were utterly spent. The findings of the grand jury served as a powerful reminder of the moral and ethical bankruptcy of the convict leasing system, a system that perpetuated the worst aspects of slavery under the guise of punishment. The brutal treatment of these convicts, coupled with the appalling conditions they endured, was a damning reflection of a society that had failed to reckon with its past and continued to inflict suffering on those it had ostensibly freed. The conditions endured by convicts under the convict leasing system are starkly exemplified by the fate of those leased to a contractor named McDonald between January 6, 1887 and June 6, 1887. During this 6-month period, the brutality of the system became tragically apparent. 20 of McDonald's leased convicts died, a grim testament to the inhumane conditions they were subjected to. Additionally, 23 convicts were returned to the state prison, disabled and gravely ill, with many of them succumbing to their ailments shortly after their return. The toll taken by this brutal system did not stop there. Approximately 19 convicts either managed to escape the horrors they faced or were discharged during this period, underscoring the desperation that drove them to flee or the arbitrary nature of their release. The situation was so dire that it prompted legislative action, albeit one that perpetuated rather than dismantled the exploitative system. On December 31, 1894, the Mississippi Constitution authorized the legislature to establish prison farms, marking a new chapter in the exploitation of convict labor. Under this law, convicts were conscripted to provide free labor for all state-supervised public works, including the construction and rebuilding of roads and levees. While this law ostensibly reformed the convict leasing system, it effectively legalized and institutionalized another form of the same exploitation, merely shifting the locus of control from private contractors to the state. J.H. Jones, reflecting on the reform system, aptly described Mississippi's approach as a product of Southern greed, deeply rooted in the conditions that slavery had left behind. The prison farms and public works projects were not just about infrastructure. They were about maintaining a social order that continued to exploit African Americans long after emancipation. The reformation of convict leasing into state-run operations did little to alleviate the suffering of those trapped within the system. Instead, it ensured that the economic benefits of their labor continued to flow to the state and its beneficiaries. The fate of the convicts leased to McDonald and the broader implications of the 1894 law illustrate how the legacy of slavery persisted in the post-Civil War South. The convict leasing system, whether under private or state control, was a continuation of the exploitation that had defined the region for generations. It was a system built on the backs of those who had been promised freedom, only to find themselves once again in chains, subjected to a cycle of abuse, neglect, and death that echoed the darkest days of slavery. The mortality rates among freedmen subjected to harsh labor contracts after being found guilty of violating South Carolina's Black Code laws were alarmingly high, reflecting a broader trend of systemic abuse throughout the southern states. From 1877 to 1880, the Greenwood and Augusta Railroad project in South Carolina saw 128 out of 285 laborers die, a staggering 44.9% of the entire convict labor force assigned to the construction. This figure underscores the brutal conditions these individuals were forced to endure, where nearly half of the workforce perished under the weight of relentless exploitation. This tragic pattern was not isolated to South Carolina. In Tennessee, during the biennium of 1884 to 1885, the convict leasing program held an average of 600 prisoners, many of whom were African Americans forced into involuntary servitude. Of these, nearly one-third, 163 individuals, died within that period. These deaths were not anomalies, they were the predictable outcomes of a system designed to extract maximum labor with little regard for human life. The contrast between the Southern convict leasing systems and the penitentiary conditions in northern states is stark. In states like Iowa, Ohio, Illinois, and New Hampshire, the annual mortality rate in penitentiaries from 1881 through 1885 was scarcely more than 1%. This dramatic difference highlights the unique cruelty of the Southern convict leasing system, where the value of black lives was measured only in terms of their economic output until their bodies could no longer sustain the brutal conditions imposed upon them. The systemic exploitation in the South, as illustrated by these mortality rates, was a continuation of the racial oppression that had defined slavery. The convict leasing system, reinforced by Black Code laws, perpetuated a cycle of violence and dehumanization where African Americans were once again reduced to tools of labor, disposable and unprotected. The sheer scale of death among these laborers speaks to the extreme brutality of the system and the utter disregard for the lives of those caught within it. In 1879, the warden of South Carolina made a chilling remark that the casualties among forced laborers would have been far fewer if the convicts were considered valuable property worth preserving. This statement laid bare the brutal reality of the convict leasing system, where the lives of the predominantly black convicts were deemed expendable. The warden's comments, particularly in light of the death of 128 laborers, underscore the fact that the vast majority of these convicts were African Americans, a reality that was consistent throughout the southern states, driven by the enforcement of black codes. The racial disparities in the convict population were stark and deliberate. Around 1880, the ratios of freedmen to white male prisoners in states like South Carolina, North Carolina, and Georgia were approximately 13-1, 11-1, and 7-1, respectively. These disparities were not mere coincidences. They were the product of a re-engineered Southern prison system that sought to re-enslave newly freed African Americans. The convict leasing system became a tool of racial control, driven by Southern white resentment toward the freedmen. This system allowed for the continuation of forced labor, effectively circumventing the abolition of slavery by using the criminal justice system to maintain racial subjugation. The intertwining of crime, infrastructure, revenue, and free labor was integral to the advent and perpetuation of the convict leasing system. Southern politicians like George D. Tillman, a Democratic leader from South Carolina and a staunch advocate of convict leasing, played pivotal roles in justifying this system. Tillman espoused racist beliefs, claiming that freedmen had an inherent propensity to steal and would naturally violate most of the Ten Commandments. He argued that the state should hire out convicts rather than burden taxpayers with their upkeep, viewing forced labor, whether through convict leasing or the remnants of chattel slavery, as the only viable conditions under which African Americans could survive. The reach of convict labor extended across various industries in the South. In Florida, it became a primary source of labor in phosphate mining, while in Georgia, Alabama, and Tennessee, convict labor was central to the coal mining industry. Moreover, these convicts were instrumental in constructing the South's expanding railroad network, their involuntary labor laying the literal and figurative tracks for the region's post-war industrialization. The convict leasing system was not just an economic enterprise, it was a racial project designed to reassert white dominance in the post-Civil War South. By leveraging the criminal justice system to enforce black codes, Southern states effectively re-enslaved African Americans, exploiting their labor under the guise of legal punishment. This system of forced labor perpetuated the racial inequalities that had defined the antebellum South, ensuring that the social and economic structures of slavery endured long after emancipation. The legacy of this system is a testament to the enduring impact of racial oppression and the lengths to which Southern society went to maintain its racial hierarchy. The treatment of convicts in the South was marked by extreme inhumanity, harshness, and brutality, particularly for African Americans who were disproportionately represented in the convict population. Those forced to build and repair the South's roads often endured deplorable conditions, housed in movable cages that offered less space per convict than a 4-foot-long box. These cages were not just a symbol of physical confinement, but also a testament to the cruel and dehumanizing conditions that defined the convict leasing system. By the 1930s, the racial disparity in the Southern prison system had only grown more pronounced. Freedmen and people of color constituted the vast majority of convicts serving sentences on chain gangs across states like Alabama, Florida, Georgia, and Virginia. In Alabama, for example, a convict crew in 1932 comprised 1,089 African Americans who were forced into labor as the state's exclusive road construction and maintenance force. This disproportionate representation of African Americans in the convict labor system was reflective of the broader racial inequalities that persisted in the South long after the abolition of slavery. In Georgia, where African Americans made up only 37% of the state's total population in 1930, they astonishingly comprised 83% of the prison population. This staggering statistic underscores the extent to which the criminal justice system was weaponized to continue the exploitation and subjugation of African Americans. The disproportionate incarceration and forced labor of African Americans were not coincidental, but rather a deliberate continuation of the racial oppression that had been institutionalized through slavery and perpetuated through the convict leasing and chain gang systems. These systems were designed to maintain racial hierarchies and economic exploitation under the guise of law and order. The conditions faced by these convicts, crammed into tiny cages, forced into back-breaking labor, and stripped of their humanity, were a direct legacy of the South's refusal to relinquish its reliance on coerced black labor. The use of chain gangs, and convict labor became a way for the Southern states to rebuild and expand their infrastructure, while simultaneously reinforcing the social and racial order that had been disrupted by the Civil War and Reconstruction. The persistence of these practices into the 1930s, decades after the end of the Civil War, reveals the deep entrenchment of racial inequality in the South. The exploitation of African American labor through the convict system was not just a vestige of the past, but a clear indication of how the South continued to resist true racial equality. The chain gangs, the cages, and the disproportionate imprisonment rates were all part of a broader strategy to maintain control over the black population and ensure their continued economic exploitation under a new guise of legality. The racial disparities in the Southern penal system during the early 20th century were stark, with only a handful of white individuals receiving jail sentences for minor offenses, while freedmen were overwhelmingly incarcerated for the same misdemeanors. In Georgia, this disparity was particularly pronounced, as African Americans were far more likely to be jailed for minor offenses that white individuals would typically avoid incarceration for. Once convicted, these freedmen were assigned to county labor, where they were forced to work on chain gangs, repairing and building roads under grueling conditions. By 1930, an estimated 2,548 African Americans in Georgia, convicted of misdemeanor offenses, were subjected to this harsh form of labor. These conditions effectively reduced freedmen to a status akin to slavery, a fate that was emblematic of the broader experience of African Americans throughout the South. The persistence of such conditions well into the 20th century highlights the systemic nature of racial oppression in the region. In 1932, the use of convict labor on chain gangs was still widespread in the Southern states. Only 23% of the region's prisoners, mostly convicted felons, labored on chain gangs, but a staggering 49% of county convicts, who were primarily misdemeanor offenders, were forced to work on road construction and repair. This disproportionate use of African American labor in public works projects reveals the continued exploitation of black bodies under the guise of punishment and law enforcement. The labor contracts that bound freedmen to white employers were often designed to strip them of their newfound freedom, binding them to conditions that offered little more liberty than they had experienced under slavery. These contracts were a means for white men to reassert control over African American labor, ensuring that the economic and social hierarchies of the antebellum South persisted. The terms of these contracts were heavily skewed in favor of white employers, leaving freedmen with few rights and little recourse, effectively trapping them in a cycle of exploitation and forced labor. The continuation of such practices into the 1930s underscores the deep-seated resistance to true emancipation in the South. The convict leasing system, chain gangs, and exploitative labor contracts were all part of a broader effort to maintain the racial order that had been threatened by the abolition of slavery. Through these mechanisms, the Southern states were able to preserve the economic benefits of forced black labor, even as they perpetuated the social and legal inequalities that kept African Americans in a state of subjugation. Of the county prisoners in the South, nearly all were black, reflecting the deep racial biases that permeated the Southern criminal justice system. This system, which had evolved from the black codes and convict leasing, continued to generate free labor for local and state governments, as well as for private individuals and corporations. The primary source of this labor was the overwhelming number of freedmen who were forced into involuntary servitude through unjust incarcerations and harsh sentencing practices. The Southern prison system, by design, perpetuated the economic exploitation of African Americans long after the formal end of slavery. The state and local governments, along with private entities, reaped the benefits of this system, which was sustained at the tremendous cost of the black population. The labor extracted from these prisoners was not just an economic tool, it was also a means of maintaining the racial order that had existed before the Civil War. The brutal conditions within state prisons served as a powerful instrument of intimidation. The relentless harshness of the prison system acted as a deterrent, used by white men to keep freedmen in their place. The fear of being subjected to the inhumane treatment that awaited them in the prison camps or on chain gangs was enough to suppress any aspirations of true freedom and equality that the freedmen might have harbored. This system of racial control ensured that African Americans remained economically and socially subordinate, reinforcing the very hierarchies that the Civil War had ostensibly dismantled. In essence, the Southern prison system became a continuation of slavery by another name. Through the systematic incarceration and forced labor of African Americans, the South was able to sustain the economic and social benefits of slavery well into the 20th century. The lives and labor of black men and women were commodified and exploited under the guise of criminal justice, all while the system maintained a facade of legality and order. This cruel reality underscores the enduring legacy of racism and the lengths to which the South went to preserve its deeply entrenched structures of white supremacy. In September 1937, a striking example of the deep entrenchment of forced labor practices in the South occurred in Warren County, Georgia. Cotton farmers there took drastic measures to prevent neighboring farmers from Glasscock County from luring away their laborers with more attractive wages. Desperate for labor, the Glasscock County farmers offered nearly double the wage rate that cotton pickers in Warren County were accustomed to receiving. Faced with the prospect of losing their workforce, Warren County farmers quickly mobilized to protect their labor force from depletion. In a system that relied heavily on the forced labor of African Americans, the usual rules of supply and demand were skewed to maintain control over the labor force. Sheriff Hogan of Warren County reported that many local farmers resorted to carrying guns and firing them into the air, a tactic intended to instill fear in both their laborers and the competing Glasscock County farmers. The message was clear. The cotton pickers were to stay put, and indeed, they stayed. Although the actions of Glasscock County farmers could have resulted in enticement charges, none were brought against them. This incident illustrates the ongoing reality of involuntary servitude in the South, even decades after the abolition of slavery. The convict leasing system had long been used to keep freedmen in a state of bondage, effectively making them the property of those who held their contracts. The apprentice laws functioned similarly, trapping the children of freedmen in binding contracts that reduced them to a status not unlike that of a slave. Anti-enticement laws were designed to protect the interests of those who exploited convict and apprentice labor, ensuring that freedmen were legally bound to fulfill the full terms of their contracts. These laws reinforced the power dynamics of the era, keeping African Americans in a cycle of economic dependence and social subjugation. The 1937 incident in Warren County reveals how deeply rooted these practices were, demonstrating that the South's reliance on forced labor and intimidation continued to thrive under the guise of legality and economic necessity. Chapter 4, Apprentice Law and Anti-Enticement. In the state of Maryland, the apprentice law was a tool of subtle cruelty, masquerading as a form of civil order. If a court found that an apprentice contract had been violated by the master or mistress, or if a complaint from an apprentice was supported by evidence, the court could impose a fine on the master or mistress. For the first offense, the fine could be up to $25, and for the second offense, it could reach as high as $50. But these fines, insignificant in amount, did little to protect the vulnerable. Under the apprentice law, sheriffs, justices of the peace, and other civil officers were required to report to the probate court twice a year, in January and July, with the names of all orphaned or indigent freedmen under the age of 18. Considering that these young freedmen were only a few months removed from being chattel slaves, it's easy to see how nearly all of them fell within the scope of this law. This effectively re-enslaved them under the guise of legality, binding them once more to a system that refused to release its hold. The court's role was to arrange the apprenticing of these young freedmen, and in a twist of bitter irony, the law favored offering the services of the apprentice to their former slave master before anyone else, provided the former master was deemed a suitable person. To secure the apprentice, the master was required to post a bond payable to the state and to agree to provide the apprentice with adequate food and clothing, and to treat them humanely, a vague promise in a world where the definition of humanity was skewed by prejudice. The master was also granted the right to administer moderate corporal punishment, a cruel echo of the power once wielded over these children's parents. A male apprentice was bound to his master until he reached the age of 21, while female apprentices remained until they were 18. In cases where the age of an apprentice was unknown or could not be determined, the court would simply assign a fixed age to the juvenile freedmen, further stripping them of their individuality and reducing their lives to a matter of legal convenience. This law, dressed in the language of protection and order, was in reality a continuation of the bondage these young freedmen had supposedly escaped, a new chain forged in the courtroom, designed to keep them tethered to their past, even as they struggled to step into a future that was meant to be free. If an apprentice attempted to flee from their master, the law was clear. The master had the right to pursue and apprehend them, dragging them back into the grip of their forced servitude. The law also cast a wide net of culpability, targeting anyone who might dare to assist a runaway apprentice. Should anyone entice an apprentice to escape, provide them with food, clothing, or even liquor without the master's explicit consent, they would be guilty of a high misdemeanor offense. The severity of this law underscored the state's determination to maintain the oppressive bonds of apprenticeship, leaving little room for mercy or escape. If a master decided he no longer wanted to continue his contract with an apprentice, he could simply approach a probate court to cancel his bond, effectively relinquishing his claim over the child. However, this did not mean freedom for the apprentice. Instead, the child would be reapprenticed, handed over to another master, with the cycle of exploitation continuing unabated. In the event of a master's death, the law favored the widow or family, granting them the first opportunity to reapprentice the juvenile, further entrenching the young freedmen in a system designed to perpetuate their subjugation. Maryland's apprentice law also imposed strict geographical limits on the relationship between master and apprentice. Masters or mistresses were forbidden from taking their apprentices out of state. Should a master defy this restriction and refuse to return the apprentice to Maryland upon the order of a law enforcement official, the apprentice would be forcibly removed from the master's custody. The courts would then reapprentice the juvenile freedman to another master within the state, ensuring that the system's control over the child's life remained unbroken. The law also provided an outlet for masters who found their apprentices difficult to manage. If an apprentice was deemed to have an incorrigible temper or exhibited ill behavior, the master could take them to court to have the contract terminated. Yet, this was not an act of liberation. It was merely a means of ridding the master of a troublesome burden, with the child likely reapprenticed to another who might enforce even harsher discipline. The darkest aspect of this law lay in its application to the children of former slaves. These children, despite their legal freedom, were often deemed to be in violation of the apprentice law, and many were held as apprentices by their former slave owners. In countless instances, children of freedmen were seized and retained by these former masters without ever being formally apprenticed through the court system. This practice turned the law into a weapon of continued oppression, binding young freedmen to their former captors and ensuring that the legacy of slavery would persist, not through chains and whips, but through the cold, calculating hand of the law. Juvenile freedmen who were formally apprenticed through the courts were often subjected to further exploitation. In many cases, these young individuals were hired out to third parties, with the wages they earned going directly to enrich their masters, who profited from their labor. The Freedmen's Bureau, recognizing the grave injustices occurring under the guise of apprenticeship, conducted investigations in Maryland and Virginia. These investigations uncovered numerous instances where hundreds of juvenile freedmen had been captured and held as apprentices without ever being formally apprenticed through a court of law, as required by the apprentice laws in both states. Such abuses were not confined to Maryland and Virginia. Similar occurrences were reported in southern states like Alabama and Kentucky. In 1865, the implementation of vagrant laws introduced special provisions that further complicated the lives of freedmen. These laws allowed southern states to apprentice freedmen children, effectively establishing another form of slavery under a different name. In South Carolina, for example, freedmen servants were forbidden from leaving their master's property without first obtaining consent, a stark reminder of the chains that still bound them despite their supposed freedom. Meanwhile, in Mississippi, the state enacted laws forbidding white men from renting land to freedmen in rural areas, confining freedmen to renting land only within town limits, thereby limiting their opportunities for independence and economic growth. South Carolina went even further by creating a separate court system specifically for trials involving offenses committed by freedmen, a clear indication of the state's intent to segregate and control the newly freed population. Across the South, freedmen were systematically prevented from practicing trades or conducting business without proper authorization, further restricting their ability to achieve true independence. These laws and practices were designed to maintain the social and economic hierarchies that had been in place before the Civil War, ensuring that, despite the formal end of slavery, the power dynamics of the Old South remained largely unchanged. These racially motivated laws, known as black codes, became increasingly transparent to Congress as tools designed to help the southern states reinstate a milder, but no less oppressive, form of slavery. Local governments across the South routinely enacted laws that allowed for the binding of juvenile freedmen as apprentices, effectively continuing the exploitation of these young individuals under the guise of legality. In Mississippi, the apprentice law permitted courts to seize and apprentice juvenile freedmen without requiring the consent of their parents, particularly if the courts determined that the parents were unable to provide adequately for their children. This power was frequently abused, with county courts arbitrarily deciding that freedmen lacked the means to care for their children. These decisions, often rooted in bias and a desire to maintain the old social order, resulted in many juvenile freedmen being handed over to their former masters under the pretext of apprenticeship. The intention behind these laws was clear: to undermine the freedom that had been hard-won through the Civil War and to reestablish control over the black population by any means necessary. The courts, empowered by these black codes, became instruments of oppression, systematically delivering young freedmen back into the hands of those who had once enslaved them, ensuring that the cycle of subjugation continued even after slavery had been officially abolished. In every instance where an apprentice was taken or detained without the consent of their employer, the employer could seek to reclaim the apprentice through an action of replevin, treating the apprentice as one might recover lost or stolen property, restoring them akin to chattel. Moreover, if an apprentice was convicted of any offense and ordered to pay a fine, the master could choose to pay the fine on their behalf. Should the master agree to cover this cost, the court would then extend the apprentice's contract by a period corresponding to the value of the fine, effectively prolonging the apprentice's term of service. This legal loophole was frequently exploited by masters who sought to extend the duration of their control over the apprentices. The apprentice laws also imposed a duty on police officers to report all freedmen under the age of 18 who were without means of support or were orphans to the probate courts in their counties on a semi-annual basis. Following these reports, the courts were obligated to apprentice these children. In a bitter twist of fate, former slave masters were given preference when seeking to secure these children as apprentices, ensuring that the very individuals who once enslaved them could continue to exploit their labor under the guise of legal apprenticeship. Male children of freedmen were bound as apprentices until they reached the age of 21, while female children were held until they turned 18. Those who employed these young apprentices were granted the authority to administer moderate whippings as a form of discipline for disobedience. The law provided legal protection for employers, aiding them in the recapture of runaway apprentices, further reinforcing the system of control. It was also deemed a criminal offense to entice an apprentice into running away, thereby criminalizing any attempts to escape the oppressive conditions of their indenture. These laws, in practice, were thinly veiled attempts to perpetuate the bondage of young freedmen, ensuring that the legacy of slavery would endure, not through ownership, but through the continued exploitation of their labor under the strict enforcement of the law. The courts, complicit in this system, upheld the rights of the masters while denying the young freedmen the true freedom they had been promised. Mississippi's apprentice law was a calculated strategy aimed at regaining control over the children of freedmen, serving a dual purpose that reinforced the state's grip on the newly emancipated black population. The first objective was to subdue the freedmen by targeting their offspring. By taking control of their children, the state could exert pressure on freedmen to remain in place, effectively discouraging them from seeking better work conditions or wandering from town to town in search of opportunities. This strategy ensured that freedmen would more readily accept the harsh and often oppressive conditions imposed by local overseers, knowing that their children's well-being, or lack thereof, could be used as leverage. Additionally, the law included stringent provisions designed to compel black laborers to fulfill their contracts, leaving them with little room to resist or seek alternatives. One such provision prohibited them from carrying firearms, dirks, or knives, effectively disarming them and stripping them of any means of self-defense or rebellion. The second, and perhaps most insidious, motive behind the apprentice law was its function as a covert mechanism for securing the long-term, involuntary labor of these apprentices. Under the guise of legal apprenticeship, the state could bind these young individuals to their masters until they reached the age of 21, effectively extending a form of bondage into what was supposed to be an era of freedom. This practice ensured a continued supply of cheap, controlled labor, all while maintaining the appearance of legality and order. In reality, Mississippi's apprentice law was a continuation of the antebellum system of exploitation, repackaged to fit the post-emancipation landscape. It allowed former slaveholders to maintain a semblance of their former power and ensured that the transition from slavery to freedom was, for many, nothing more than a shift from one form of servitude to another. On November 22, 1865, Mississippi codified a series of laws collectively known as the Apprentice Laws, aimed at exerting control over the freedmen and their children. Section 2 of these laws required that any master or mistress taking on an apprentice must execute a bond and security payable to the state of Mississippi to secure the labor of the apprentice. This bond was meant to ensure that the master provided the apprentice with sufficient food, clothing, and humane treatment. Additionally, the master had to agree to comply with any future laws regulating the duties and relationships between master and apprentice, essentially binding them to an evolving legal framework designed to perpetuate control over the apprentice. The law extended its reach to individuals, businesses, jails, prisons, or corporations within the state that agreed to these terms and had the financial means to pay the state. Under this legal arrangement, they could hold minors in involuntary servitude until the age of 21 for males and 18 for females, effectively extending a form of legalized bondage well beyond the abolition of slavery. Section 3 of the law granted masters and mistresses the authority to manage and control their apprentices, including the right to inflict moderate corporal punishment. This provision echoed the antebellum practices where a master could whip his slave, further blurring the line between the old and new systems of labor exploitation. In Section 4, the law addressed the issue of runaway apprentices. It empowered the master or mistress to pursue and recapture any apprentice who attempted to flee. Once apprehended, the apprentice was to be remanded and returned to the master's custody. Should the apprentice refuse to return, they would be jailed. If the apprentice could not pay the bond required for release, and it was determined that they had abandoned their master without just cause, the law allowed for the apprentice to be beaten until they agreed to return to their master, reinforcing the brutal measures used to maintain control. Finally, Section 5 of the Apprentice Law imposed severe penalties on anyone who interfered with the relationship between master and apprentice. If a person enticed an apprentice away from their master, knowingly hired an apprentice without the master's consent, or provided the apprentice with food or clothing, that person would be deemed guilty of a high misdemeanor. The county court had the authority to punish such individuals, employing the same methods used to penalize those who enticed hired freedmen away from their employers. Mississippi's apprentice laws were a clear attempt to recreate a system of control that closely mirrored the conditions of slavery, disguising it under the legal framework of apprenticeship. The laws allowed former slaveholders to continue exploiting the labor of freedmen and their children, ensuring that the transition from slavery to freedom remained fraught with exploitation and oppression. The Enticement Act made it illegal to lure a worker away from his employer by offering him inducements of any kind. Its purpose, of course, was to restrict the flow and price of labor by forcing plantation owners to stop stealing each other's Negroes. In 1866, on a Mississippi Delta plantation, a desperate act of survival unfolded when a black woman named Viney stole a 40-pound pig from plantation owner Wilmer Shields. The reason behind her action was heartbreakingly simple. Viney's small children were starving with nothing to eat. Driven by the instinct to protect and provide for her children, she took the pig, knowing full well the risks involved. In response, Shields, adhering to the new legal frameworks of the post-Civil War South, sought to exact a heavy price for the stolen pig. He summoned a sheriff from Natchez, intent on making Viney pay for her transgression. Before the Civil War, such an offense would have been handled by the plantation master himself, likely resulting in a severe whipping. However, in the postbellum South, the legal system had shifted in ways that continued to oppress the black population. Instead of the whip, the justice system wielded chains and prison labor. Thousands of ex-slaves like Viney were being arrested, tried, convicted, and sentenced to years of hard labor for minor offenses, crimes born out of poverty and desperation. What was once dealt with as a matter of plantation discipline had transformed into a mechanism for re-enslavement, with the court stepping in to enforce harsh punishments that echoed the brutality of the past. Viney's act of theft, driven by the need to feed her hungry children, became a stark illustration of how the legal system in the post-Civil War South was weaponized to maintain the racial hierarchy and keep the newly freed black population under control. The former Confederate states, in their relentless pursuit to control the newly freed black labor force, crafted enticement laws, embedding them into their criminal statutes. These laws became one of the most effective tools designed to maintain the subjugation of black workers. The Black Codes, a series of racially motivated laws, worked in concert to impose a network of restrictions on freedmen, ensuring that the emancipation granted by the Civil War was, in practice, limited and conditional. Enticement laws were particularly insidious because they targeted the fundamental freedom to choose one's employer. These laws made it illegal for a freedman or a potential employer to enter into a new labor contract if the freedman was already employed. Essentially, these laws bound the freedman to his current overseer, who had the legal right to retain the worker if he desired. If a freedman sought to leave his overseer and entered into another labor contract, he would be violating both the vagrancy and enticement laws. These two laws, when violated together, formed a formidable legal trap that kept the freedman tied to a system resembling slavery. As time progressed, these laws did not fade, but were, in some cases, strengthened. In 1920, Alabama made the mere attempt to entice a worker away from their employer a crime. 3 years later, Arkansas increased the maximum penalties for those convicted under its enticement laws. In 1928, following a restrictive court decision, Mississippi was compelled to amend its enticement statute, limiting its application to only those who willfully violated it. North Carolina, too, was relentless, enacting nearly half a dozen enticement laws. In 1905, the state introduced an enticement law specifically targeting tenants and croppers in certain counties, further tightening the grip on the black labor force. These enticement laws served a dual purpose. First, they prevented would-be employers from enticing or luring laborers away from their current overseers. Second, they stripped freedmen of the ability to seek better opportunities or improve compensation, binding them to their current, often exploitative, conditions. These laws effectively established proprietary claims of employers over their workers, making it unlawful to hire a laborer already under contract. Furthermore, immigrant agent statutes imposed exorbitant fees on those who made a living moving labor from one state to another, thereby curtailing the mobility and economic freedom of black workers. Together, these statutes wove a boundless web of control, effectively legalizing a renewed form of slavery under the guise of law and order. The Black Codes were not merely laws, but a cohesive system designed to render the freedman and his descendants inferior, ensnaring them in a perpetual state of economic and social subjugation. A stark example of the reach of these laws occurred in 1918 when South Carolina authorities arrested a black man named Drayton Bates. Bates, hailing from North Carolina, was charged with violating South Carolina's immigrant agent law. He had been sent by his overseer to Pomara, South Carolina, to recruit farmhands. Bates admitted that he had successfully recruited only 2 men, but despite this minimal activity and his lack of professional status as an agent, the Supreme Court of South Carolina upheld his conviction. The court ruled that it did not matter whether Bates was a professional agent. Under South Carolina's immigrant agent law, it was simply a crime to transport laborers out of the state. This case exemplified how these laws were not just about regulating labor. They were about ensuring that the legacy of control and oppression persisted long after the abolition of slavery. Moses Chambers, unlike Drayton Bates, experienced a small victory in the face of the oppressive legal landscape of the South. Chambers was arrested in Cartersville, Georgia, after simply asking a fellow freedman if he was interested in traveling to Tennessee to work for Alcoa, where the pay was $2.50 per day, a substantial sum for the time. However, Chambers' case took a different turn when it reached Georgia's High Court. The court determined that there was reasonable doubt as to whether Chambers was acting as a labor agent. Instead, he was seen as nothing more than an eager job seeker, hoping to share an opportunity for better wages with another freedman. With this conclusion, Chambers was acquitted. Chambers' case highlights the deeply ingrained proprietary attitude toward black labor that was prevalent in the postbellum South. The harsh sanctions against immigrant agents, along with the severe penalties imposed by enticement laws, were manifestations of a sentiment that dated back to the era of slavery. During slavery, the relationship between the slave and the slave master was defined by the master's control over the slave's labor and movement. This same attitude persisted after emancipation, as white men continued to see themselves as the keepers of naive freedmen, reacting to any threat of enticement as if their personal property were being taken away. The laws and the social attitudes they reflected were designed to keep black laborers bound to the land and the employers who sought to exploit their work. The mere possibility of a freedman seeking better opportunities elsewhere was perceived as a direct challenge to the economic order that the white population sought to maintain. By criminalizing the movement of black workers and the actions of those who might offer them better opportunities, the South effectively maintained a form of economic enslavement long after the formal institution of slavery had been abolished. The contract enforcement statutes were designed with a clear objective: to limit the mobility and opportunities of freedmen, effectively binding them to their current employers. The Immigrant Agent and Enticement Acts, however, were particularly insidious, as they focused not only on controlling black laborers, but also on restricting the actions of other white employers. These laws were crafted to prevent white employers from soliciting black laborers away from their current white employers, thereby maintaining a tight grip on the labor force. The aim of these laws was twofold: to limit the ability of freedmen to seek better employment opportunities and to curb the recruitment practices of potential white employers who might offer more favorable conditions. Any attempt to persuade freedmen to leave the service of their current employers was met with severe consequences, including heavy fines. These measures were not just about maintaining the economic status quo, but were also about reinforcing the social hierarchy that placed black workers at the bottom and kept them there through legal means. By restricting the movement of black laborers and penalizing those who might offer them a chance at better wages or conditions, these statutes ensured that the newly freed black population remained economically dependent and socially subordinate. The heavy fines imposed on those who tried to entice freedmen away from their current employment served as a powerful deterrent, preserving the labor dynamics that had existed before emancipation, only now wrapped in the language of contract law and legal enforcement. Sharecropping in the South emerged as another method to secure essentially free labor, a system deeply rooted in practices borrowed from colonial Africa, Scotland, and Ireland, where sharecropping had been prevalent long before it was introduced in the United States. During the Reconstruction period from 1865 to 1877, sharecropping and tenant farming became widespread across the southern regions of the country. The South, ravaged by the Civil War, saw its planter class in a difficult position. They possessed vast tracts of fertile land, but lacked the currency to pay for the labor necessary to cultivate it. At the same time, the freedmen, recently emancipated but left destitute, were physically capable and ready to work. However, they lacked the money and land to start independent farming. Fearful of any system resembling the gang labor of slavery, which they had only recently escaped, the freedmen vehemently protested against such practices. Tenant farmers in the South typically owned their cattle and farming instruments, while sharecroppers did not own any farm tools or livestock. The sharecropping system was particularly focused on the cultivation of cash crops, especially cotton, and was designed to generate capital primarily for landowners, merchants, and, to a lesser extent, the sharecroppers themselves. Due to the pervasive political, judicial, economic, and racial oppression, freedmen were often coerced into becoming sharecroppers, and in some cases, tenant farmers. Southern authorities ensured that nearly the entire population of freedmen became sharecroppers for white landowners, binding them to a system that, while different in name, bore a striking resemblance to the conditions of slavery. Over time, freedmen and the system of sharecropping became synonymous, and many remained trapped in this cycle involuntarily until the mid-20th century. Compounding this systemic exploitation were the pig laws, which filled Southern jails and penitentiaries with freedmen who were disenfranchised and forced into involuntary servitude. The vagrancy laws further amplified the functionality of the black codes, essentially criminalizing black existence in the South and serving as a principal tool in returning freedmen to conditions akin to slavery. Under the convict leasing system, these laws turned freedmen into forced laborers, tasked with rebuilding the economy and infrastructure of the Southern states, effectively making them the property of their contract holders. The apprentice laws worked in parallel, placing young freedmen into binding apprentice contracts, while anti-enticement laws safeguarded the interests of the contractors or overseers, protecting the terms of their contracts with convict laborers and apprentices. Following the Civil War and the collapse of their old system of slavery, many Southern whites harbored deep resentment towards the freedmen. This animosity manifested itself in various forms, politically, financially, academically, and socially throughout the South. The implementation of sharecropping, the enforcement of discriminatory laws, and the establishment of systems like convict leasing were all part of a broader effort to maintain the racial hierarchy and ensure that, despite the end of slavery, the economic and social subjugation of black people in the South continued unabated. Chapter 5, A Southern Sentiment. In 1898, the Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of Mississippi's disfranchisement procedures in the landmark case of Williams v. Mississippi. This ruling emboldened other Southern states which, seeing that the federal government would not intervene to protect the political rights of black citizens, quickly followed Mississippi's lead. Mississippi once again positioned itself at the forefront of efforts to address what was cynically referred to as the Negro problem. Though the 13th Amendment to the Constitution legally abolished slavery, its legacy, marked by forced labor, inhumanity, and the denial of citizenship, endured. 75 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, freedmen in the South were still largely held in a state of captivity. They were whipped with the lash and compelled to provide free labor, echoing the conditions of bondage from which they had ostensibly been freed. While many historians have meticulously documented the repressive effects of peonage, tenant farming, sharecropping, and the cropland system, few have fully examined the broader system of involuntary servitude in which these practices were entrenched. This system, with its intricate network of legal, economic, and social controls, effectively maintained the structures of slavery long after its formal abolition. The persistence of these practices underscores the continuity of oppression and the profound challenges that Black Americans faced in their struggle for true freedom and equality. The narrative of emancipation, often celebrated as a final victory over slavery, is thus more accurately understood as a beginning, one that left many freedmen still shackled by the remnants of an old but resilient order. This system of racially discriminatory laws, known as the Black Codes, was a complex network of state regulations designed to legally entrench the involuntary servitude of black laborers, serving the interests of both private individuals and local governments as they saw fit. Beyond the legal framework, involuntary servitude was deeply embedded in Southern customs, bolstered by a pervasive belief that justified the forced labor of black people. This societal endorsement often led to the coercion of black labor without even the semblance of legal justification, making the practice both widespread and insidious. In the years immediately following Reconstruction, the Black Codes played a central role in perpetuating this system. These laws not only sustained the practice of involuntary servitude, but also grew in strength over time, operating in the shadows of Southern society. This oppressive system remained largely unchallenged and hidden from broader public scrutiny until 1907, when its existence began to come to light. By that time, the intricate combination of legal and extra-legal forces had entrenched a reality for black laborers that was disturbingly similar to the conditions they had endured under slavery. The Black Codes, thus, represented not just a continuation of forced labor, but a calculated and systemic effort to maintain white supremacy and economic control in the post-Civil War South. The overall Southern sentiment toward the newly freed slaves was overwhelmingly harsh and dehumanizing. Many white Southerners viewed the freedmen not as human beings, but as an inferior caste destined to remain under the control and domination of their white counterparts. This deeply ingrained belief fueled the enforcement of the Black Codes, a set of laws specifically designed to oppress and exploit black people. The situation for the freedmen became especially dire when they were accused of violating any of these codes. Once a freedman was deemed to be in violation of a Black Code, he was swiftly brought before a judge. In a legal system steeped in racial bias, he would almost inevitably be convicted of vagrancy or some other contrived offense and sentenced to prison. The demographics of state prisons during this period were stark. In many instances, 9/10 of the prison population was composed of persons of color. These black prisoners were divided into chain gangs and hired out to private contractors, who often subleased their labor. The freedmen, now prisoners, were forced to work in brutal conditions, mining, constructing railways, and building turnpikes, all under the constant surveillance of guards armed with Winchester rifles. This system of convict leasing reduced the freedmen to a state of mind slavery, where they were subjected to relentless exploitation and dehumanization, reminiscent of the very slavery they had supposedly escaped. The Southern states, through these practices, effectively re-enslaved black people, using the legal system to perpetuate their oppression and maintain the racial and economic hierarchies that had defined the antebellum South. Although the slave had been legally freed, he was left destitute, without a home, without means, and without the resources to provide for himself. His labor, once the backbone of the Southern economy, had contributed immensely to the prosperity of others and to the building of the nation. Yet, as a free man, he was denied any share in the wealth and splendor that his endless toil had helped to create. The Southern states, long accustomed to their system of chattel slavery, were unwilling to relinquish their control over black labor. Their response was the creation and enforcement of black codes, laws explicitly designed to strip the freedmen of their newfound rights and reduce their status to that of their former selves, in essence, slaves in all but name. The broad array of black code laws was not merely a collection of discriminatory statutes, it was a deliberate strategy to reimpose a system of economic and social subjugation on the freedmen. These laws sought to curtail every aspect of black life, from movement and employment to legal rights and personal freedoms. Through these measures, the South aimed to transform the freedmen's nominal freedom into a state of serfdom where they remained bound to the land and to the whims of white landowners. The black codes made it clear that, despite the abolition of slavery, the South was determined to maintain the racial hierarchies and economic structures that had long defined its society. The state of Louisiana, through a series of racially inspired laws, effectively criminalized its entire population of freedmen by embedding discriminatory measures into its constitutional framework. One such law mandated that every adult freed black man and woman must secure an adequate home and demonstrate apparent means of supporting themselves within 20 days. If they failed to meet these stringent demands, they were arrested and subsequently hired out at public auction for the remainder of the year. This law was a direct continuation of the oppressive practices of the past, as Louisiana, much like Alabama, preserved and continued to use the old slave auction blocks for this purpose. These laws were more than just tools of oppression. They were a calculated attempt to undermine the 13th Amendment, which had legally abolished slavery. By criminalizing basic survival, such as the failure to secure housing or employment within an impossibly short time frame, Louisiana's laws were designed to re-enslave freedmen under the guise of legality. The public auction of those who could not comply was a stark reminder of the brutal system that had supposedly been eradicated, showing that, in many ways, the South sought to nullify the freedom that the 13th Amendment was intended to guarantee. These enactments made it clear that the South was determined to maintain control over black lives, ensuring that the legacy of slavery continued in all but name. The practices of the black codes throughout the South eventually drew the attention and scrutiny of Congress, particularly during the deliberations surrounding the slaughterhouse cases. In these cases, Mr. Justice Miller, who delivered the majority opinion, starkly acknowledged the dire situation for black Americans in the South. He remarked that without the protection of the federal government, the black race would be subjected to conditions that were almost worse than slavery in the southern states. These black codes, racially inspired laws, were specifically designed to impose severe disabilities and burdens upon the black population, effectively stifling their rights to life, liberty, and property. The laws were so insidiously effective that they rendered the freedom of persons of color nearly meaningless. Under these laws, the so-called freedoms granted by the 13th Amendment were systematically undermined, ensuring that the newly freed black population remained trapped in a state of near total subjugation. As James Blaine, a prominent political figure, once observed, the effect of these laws was to nullify the very essence of freedom, reducing the rights of black individuals to mere abstractions, devoid of any practical value. The black codes were not just legal statutes, they were instruments of racial control, designed to perpetuate the oppression of the black race in the guise of law and order. Without the light of citizenship, his freedom could be maintained only in name, and without the elective franchise, his citizenship would have no legitimate and no authoritative protection. The legalized discrimination that the freedmen faced under South Carolina's black codes infiltrated the most intimate aspects of their personal lives, severely limiting their opportunities for financial independence and security. Despite these overwhelming obstacles, the freedmen of South Carolina persisted in their struggle for a better existence, holding on to the hope that the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which supported racial equality, might herald meaningful change. However, the harsh realities of the black codes impacted all freedmen across the South in much the same way, enforcing a system of racial oppression that curtailed their freedoms and economic opportunities. Under South Carolina law, it was illegal for any Negro or person of color to hold any form of employment beyond that of a servant under contract for labor or in the care, cultivation, and breeding of crops and animals. This restriction effectively barred freedmen from pursuing employment in any profession traditionally held by white Southerners, such as artists, tradesmen, businessmen, or mechanics. The state went further by making it unlawful for any Negro or person of color engaged in farming to sell products such as wheat, grain, corn, rice, peas, flour, meat, cotton, or hay without written authorization from their employer. These laws were designed to maintain the economic subjugation of black people, ensuring that they remained dependent on and subservient to white employers. By restricting their employment opportunities and controlling their ability to engage in commerce, South Carolina's Black Code sought to preserve the racial hierarchy that had defined the antebellum South. The freedmen were left with little choice but to work in conditions that closely resembled the bondage from which they had only recently been freed, their aspirations for true freedom and self-sufficiency constantly undermined by a legal system designed to keep them in a state of perpetual dependency. In this case, the freedmen were also prohibited from securing a license to sell the mentioned items. The fears and deep-seated prejudices of Southern white citizens, coupled with a long-held belief in the inferiority and substandard nature of black people, culminated in the creation of the Black Codes throughout the South. Following their defeat in the Civil War, Southern white men openly and boldly wielded these Black Codes to legally define Negroes and persons of color as incapable of self-governance, inherently different, and unequivocally inferior. These laws were crafted not only to maintain racial hierarchies, but also to reassert control over the black population in a post-emancipation society, ensuring that the social order of the antebellum South persisted even in the face of legal abolition. In the aftermath of the radical Reconstruction of 1869, South Carolina implemented a stringent contract law designed to exert control over the newly freed black labor force. This law stipulated that any laborer who failed to perform the labor reasonably requested of him or who refused to comply with the conditions of his contract would be in violation of the law. The penalties for such violations were severe. A worker found in breach of this contract law could be fined or imprisoned, with the punishment determined by the perceived severity of the offense. This law was part of a broader effort to maintain the subjugation of black workers by legally binding them to oppressive labor conditions. By criminalizing the refusal to fulfill labor contracts, South Carolina ensured that black laborers remained economically dependent and subject to the whims of their employers. The law effectively transformed contractual agreements into instruments of coercion, where any attempt by a laborer to seek better conditions or resist exploitation could result in legal punishment. This approach underscored the South's determination to preserve a racial and economic hierarchy that kept black people in a position of vulnerability and servitude despite the formal end of slavery. In 1907, two separate courts declared Section 357 of the South Carolina Criminal Code of 1902 unconstitutional, recognizing that it placed laborers in a condition of peonage. In overturning South Carolina's contract law, both the state Supreme Court and the federal district court unequivocally stated that the law had been created with the specific intent to control black labor. Despite this legal defeat, South Carolina, like many other southern states, responded by revising and reintroducing their racially inspired laws under the guise of newly drafted legislation. The political ruling class of South Carolina was resolutely committed to maintaining a system of involuntary servitude. Between 1907 and 1918, the state adopted 4 new racially motivated laws aimed at preserving this system. These laws continued to criminalize the breach of labor contracts, thereby reducing freedmen to a state of near serfdom. The legal framework was designed to ensure that any attempt by black laborers to resist exploitation or seek better opportunities was met with harsh punishment, effectively binding them to a life of economic dependence and limited freedom. By continually revising their laws to sidestep constitutional challenges, South Carolina and other southern states sought to perpetuate the racial and economic hierarchies that had long defined the region, ensuring that the promise of emancipation remained unfulfilled for many black Americans. The multi-layered and cooperative efforts of the Black Codes provided the southern ruling class with a framework that offered the appearance of legitimacy and legal order. However, the undeniable truth, supported by a wealth of evidence and historical facts, is that the Black Codes were fundamentally a system rooted in the exploitation of persons of color and the preservation of the old religion of white supremacy. These laws institutionalized the right of white Southerners to exploit black labor at their discretion, reflecting the deeply ingrained conscience and mindset of many white Southerners who believed in their inherent right to control and use black people as they saw fit. Involuntary servitude, as enforced by the black codes, often transcended the bounds of peonage, particularly when it surpassed the legal limitations ostensibly placed upon it. This system was a complex blend of slavery and freedom, creating a paradoxical reality where white men could significantly restrict the lives of freedmen while granting them just enough mobility to maintain a veneer of freedom. By doing so, the system held a substantial number of black people in a state of captivity under the guise of legal contracts and obligations, while allowing others a limited degree of freedom. This careful balancing act enabled the Southern states to maintain a form of involuntary servitude that could coexist with moderate freedmen mobility. It was a system designed to give the appearance of legal and social progress while continuing to uphold the economic and racial hierarchies that had been the foundation of the antebellum South. In this way, the South could perpetuate its exploitation of black labor, keeping the freedmen in a state of economic dependence and social subordination, even as they were technically free under the law. Before 1969, a significant number of freedmen began moving from the southeast to the southwest, and eventually, many started migrating northward. This migration was possible within the framework of involuntary servitude only when labor was in high demand in certain regions. However, when there was a perceived shortage of involuntary servants, Southern whites often resorted to stringent measures to control and further criminalize the movement of black people. This strategy proved effective, as it frequently led to the courts and prisons being filled with able-bodied persons of color who were then coerced into becoming involuntary servants. The black codes of the South, working in tandem with court magistrates and law enforcement officials, created what could be described as an assembly line of freedmen laborers. Within the expansive and oppressive web of racially inspired laws, a person of color could find himself trapped in a vicious cycle, transitioning from slave to freedman only to be reduced to a state of servitude once again. This cycle was not incidental, but rather the deliberate and primary objective of laws like the Immigrant Agent and Enticement Acts. In 1916 and 1909, as the migration of freedmen out of the South gained momentum, white Southerners employed every conceivable method, including violence, to prevent them from leaving the postbellum South. The oppressive measures taken were not merely about maintaining a labor force, but about sustaining a social order rooted in racial subjugation. This grim reality was echoed in writings from the time, such as a 1938 piece by Jonathan Daniels, who cited a Southern editor stating, with a sense of resigned clarity, that the institution of slavery was still very much in effect. This sentiment underscored the persistence of a system designed to keep black people bound in a form of economic and social captivity, despite the formal end of slavery. The legacy of these practices was a testament to the enduring struggle of black Americans to secure true freedom and autonomy in a society determined to limit their mobility and opportunities at every turn. With the emancipation of over 300,000 slaves, Mississippi faced a daunting challenge: what to do with the newly freed black population. The state was desperate for a solution to manage what they perceived as a problem: the sudden presence of a large, free black population. Although the enforcement of laws regarding freedmen was somewhat sporadic before 1880, by the turn of the 20th century, the Vagrancy Acts had become the cornerstone of Mississippi's system of involuntary servitude. More than any of the Black Code laws, the rigorous and effective enforcement of vagrancy statutes epitomized the enduring belief among white Southerners that they had the right to control and exploit black labor as they saw fit. These laws were crafted and enforced to maintain the economic and social order that had defined the antebellum South, ensuring that the freedmen could still be held in a state of de facto bondage, their labor exploited without their consent. The vagrancy statutes were a clear reflection of how the free labor market in Mississippi and the broader South fluctuated. This market was not free in any meaningful sense. It was heavily manipulated to align with the needs of white landowners and employers. The availability of black labor and the migration patterns of black workers were closely monitored and controlled through these laws. When black laborers were scarce, enforcement of vagrancy laws would intensify, effectively coercing freedmen back into labor contracts under the threat of imprisonment or fines. These statutes served as a tool to regulate and control the movement and employment opportunities of black people, ensuring that the economic structures of the South continued to benefit from their labor, just as they had during slavery. The so-called free labor market was a mirage, with the vagrancy laws ensuring that black labor remained anything but free. The border police in every county imposed a poll tax of $1 on every freedman between the ages of 18 and 60. Failure to pay this tax was treated as prima facie evidence of vagrancy. Once a freedman was deemed a vagrant, the sheriff would arrest him and hire him out to cover the cost of the poll tax, along with any other expenses associated with his arrest and detention. This system effectively criminalized poverty, using unpaid taxes as a pretext to force freedmen back into labor. If a freedman who had been convicted and placed under a labor contract quit providing labor for his overseer before the contract expired and without just cause, he would automatically forfeit any wages he had earned for his previous services. This forfeiture served as a powerful deterrent against seeking better working conditions or attempting to leave an exploitative situation. Moreover, police officials were instructed to arrest any freedmen who abandoned their labor contracts and return them to their original place of employment. For their efforts, these officers were entitled to a fee of $5.10 per mile traveled between the place of arrest and the place from which the freedman had escaped. The employer was responsible for paying these apprehension costs directly to the police officer, with the cost subsequently levied against the future earnings of the freedman. This system further entrenched freedmen in a cycle of debt and forced labor, where any attempt to escape or resist exploitation resulted in additional financial burdens that kept them bound to their employers. These practices illustrate how the post-emancipation legal system in the South was designed to maintain the subjugation of black people, transforming legal and financial obligations into tools for re-enslaving them. The poll tax, vagrancy laws, and enforcement mechanisms all work together to ensure that freedmen remain economically dependent, their labor exploited, and their freedom severely curtailed. State legislation concerning the freedmen was methodically crafted and further fortified by the reenactment of the penal and criminal statutes that once governed the lives of slaves. These legislative actions, under the guise of legality, effectively resurrected the institution of slavery in a new, yet all too familiar form. The reimplementation of the old slave codes was a transparent and deliberate effort to reinstate and perpetuate slavery in its purest, most unyielding state. Among the most pernicious of these laws were the vagrancy statutes, which were selectively enforced against freedmen and persons of color. These laws singled out this vulnerable population, making them the only group compelled by law to secure a home within a specified time frame. In essence, these vagrancy laws served as a tool of oppression, designed to curtail the newfound freedom of the emancipated, tethering them once again to the chains from which they had so recently been released. This legal framework was not merely punitive, but a calculated strategy to maintain the racial hierarchy and social order that had long underpinned the institution of slavery. The black codes enacted by the state of Mississippi were emblematic of the racially motivated legislation prevalent throughout the southern states. In 1865, Mississippi codified its commitment to segregation and racial hierarchy by declaring it unlawful for any officer, station agent, collector, or employee on any railroad within the state to permit any freedman, Negro, or mulatto to ride in first-class passenger cars reserved exclusively for white persons. This statute was not merely a regulation of public transportation, but a deliberate attempt to enforce racial segregation and reinforce the social order that had been upended by emancipation. Violations of this provision were deemed misdemeanors, punishable by fines ranging from $50 to $500. The punitive measures extended further still. If the violator, whether a freedman or another person of color, lacked the means to pay the fine, they faced imprisonment in the county jail. Their confinement was not simply a matter of serving time, it was a means of exploiting their labor. While in the state's custody, these individuals were coerced into labor contracts and hired out, their toil enriching the state and perpetuating their subjugation under a different guise. The insidiousness of this system was particularly evident during the harvest season, when the demand for laborers in the cotton fields became urgent. In such times, the vigilance of local law enforcement intensified as they scoured communities for so-called vagrants. Late in 1901, several towns in Mississippi rounded up those labeled as idlers and wanderers, convicting them of vagrancy. a crime deliberately constructed to ensnare the black population. Once convicted, these individuals were forcibly conscripted into the cotton fields, satisfying the desperate need of white farmers for black laborers to harvest the season's crop. This practice was not only an egregious exploitation of labor, but a blatant disregard for justice. The Supreme Court of Mississippi had previously identified certain crimes as being more commonly committed by freedmen and, in a further act of racial discrimination, elevated these offenses to the level of felonies. Through these measures, Mississippi's black codes did not merely enforce segregation, they sought to reimpose the conditions of slavery through legal means, systematically denying the freedoms and rights that had been hard-won by the formerly enslaved. In the South, the prevailing sentiment among Southern whites, particularly farmers and the political elite, regarding the disfranchisement of freedmen was deeply entwined with a fundamental economic rationale. Their perspective was clear and unyielding. If a freedman were allowed to participate in the political sphere, it would inevitably signal the end of his utility as a laborer. The underlying fear was that, should such political engagement occur, the control and exploitation of the freedman would be rendered impossible, thereby threatening the economic foundations upon which the Southern states had long relied. The South, in its relentless pursuit of maintaining the status quo, sought to reduce the freedman to merely an industrial and economic entity, devoid of political agency or autonomy. The Southern white populace, therefore, felt compelled to assert control over the freedmen, not out of mere prejudice or animosity alone, but from a perceived economic necessity. This belief dictated that the labor of a freedman must be strictly managed, and that control must be exerted over him to preserve the economic structure that had sustained the South before and after the Civil War. In this context, disfranchisement was not merely a political act. It was an essential tool in the broader strategy to subjugate the freedman and ensure that his labor remained under the firm grip of those who sought to exploit it. On November 29, 1865, the state of Mississippi enacted a series of legislative acts aimed squarely at imposing further restrictions on the freedmen. These laws were designed to curtail the newly won freedoms of black individuals, reinforcing the subjugation that had been characteristic of the antebellum South. Section 1 of these acts explicitly prohibited any freedman or person of color from possessing or carrying a firearm unless they were members of the military or had obtained a license from the Board of Police in their county. This provision was not merely a matter of public safety, but a deliberate attempt to disarm and thereby disempower the black population. Any violation of this statute would result in a fine not exceeding $10, along with the payment of court costs. Moreover, all firearms or ammunition found in the possession of the violator would be subject to forfeiture, further stripping them of their ability to defend themselves or their newfound freedoms. Section 2 of the legislation targeted the spiritual leadership within the black community, stipulating that any freedman or mulatto who sought to exercise the role of a minister of the gospel without a license from a recognized church would be subject to imprisonment. Additionally, the section allowed for the imprisonment of any freedman or mulatto convicted of committing a misdemeanor, with the court having the discretion to impose a sentence of up to 30 days. These provisions were not only restrictive, but also punitive, designed to undermine the social and religious structures that were beginning to form within the black community during the Reconstruction era. Through these laws, Mississippi sought to reassert control over the lives of the freedmen, ensuring that the legacy of slavery would continue to cast its long shadow over the South. Section 3 of the legislation further entrenched the racial hierarchy by criminalizing any act of assistance that might empower the freedmen or persons of color. It decreed that if any white person were to sell, lend, or give a firearm, knife, or ammunition to a freedman or person of color, they would be subject to a fine of $50 upon conviction in the county court and could face up to 30 days of imprisonment. This provision was a calculated effort to prevent any form of self-defense or resistance among the black population, reinforcing their vulnerability and the dominance of white supremacy. Section 5 imposed severe penalties on freedmen or persons of color who were convicted of misdemeanors under the Act. Should they fail or refuse to pay the imposed fine and court costs within 5 days, they would be subjected to an even more dehumanizing punishment. The sheriff was authorized to hire them out at a public auction to any white person willing to pay the fine and costs, effectively turning the convict into a temporary laborer for the shortest period of time required to settle the debt. This practice, thinly veiled as a legal penalty, was nothing less than a reversion to the bondage from which these individuals had only recently been freed. It perpetuated a system of exploitation and control, ensuring that the economic and social chains of slavery remained firmly in place, even as the legal status of the individuals had ostensibly changed. Through these measures, Mississippi's laws sought not only to punish, but to re-enslave, under the guise of justice, those who dared to defy the racial order. Conclusion. The institution of chattel slavery in the South was rooted in a ruthless purpose and sustained by a toxic ideology. The fundamental aim of this system was to ensure that white men could exploit the labor of black individuals using either force or coercion without any personal cost. This exploitation was justified by a pervasive and bitter belief that black people, along with persons of color and those of mixed race, were inherently inferior and not fully human. This belief was deliberately cultivated to strip African slaves of any aspirations toward equality, whether social, political, economic, or racial. At its core, slavery functioned like a pair of iron shackles, one locked around forced labor, the other around the denial of humanity and citizenship. These were the twin pillars of slavery, the foundation of a system meticulously designed to dehumanize and exploit, ensuring that those enslaved remained eternally bound, both physically and spiritually. On May 9, 1865, the Civil War officially ended, signaling the abolition of slavery for 4 million black people who had endured the brutal reality of bondage. However, the promise of freedom was quickly undermined as Southern states enacted and enforced black code laws, which sought to bind the newly emancipated freedmen back into the chains of forced labor and social subjugation. These laws, effectively an extension of the institution of slavery, remained active for over 3 decades, from 1865 until 1896. The black codes were designed with one purpose: to maintain the racial and economic hierarchy that had defined the antebellum South. Through a series of oppressive measures, these laws denied freedmen their basic human rights and citizenship, forcing them into a new form of involuntary servitude. The codes severely restricted the freedom of movement, employment opportunities, and civil rights of African Americans, effectively stripping them of the liberties that emancipation was supposed to guarantee. Despite the popular belief held by many historians and the general population that slavery ended with the conclusion of the Civil War, the reality was far more complex and tragic. The institution of slavery, albeit under a different guise, persisted well beyond 1865. The black codes, along with other legal and extra-legal measures, ensured that the economic and social control over black labor continued, allowing the South to reconstruct its economy on the backs of the very people it had enslaved for centuries. The enduring legacy of the black codes demonstrates that the end of the Civil War did not bring true freedom for African Americans. Instead, it marked the beginning of a new struggle against systemic racism and economic exploitation, a struggle that would continue to shape the lives of black Americans for generations to come. The so-called end of slavery in 1865 was not the complete liberation that it was heralded to be, but rather a transition to a new form of bondage that would persist in various forms long into the future. The South, reeling from the economic devastation wrought by the Civil War, found itself starved of capital and desperate to rebuild its shattered economy. In response, the Southern states enacted a series of racially motivated laws that effectively criminalized the entire black population, trapping them in a cycle of exploitation and forced labor. These laws, a continuation of the oppressive black codes, targeted freedmen, stripping them of their hard-won freedom under the guise of legal enforcement. Once convicted, often on the flimsiest of pretexts, these freedmen were forced into labor contracts that bound them to the backbreaking work of constructing or reconstructing the South's vital infrastructure. Railroads stretched across every Southern state were laid with the sweat and blood of black convicts, who were also tasked with rebuilding the levees that protected Southern communities from flooding. As the economic rewards of this forced convict labor became apparent, the fervor with which police officers, sheriffs, and judges pursued black men and women intensified. The Southern justice system, now deeply entwined with economic interests, became a tool of racial subjugation, using the pretext of law and order to maintain a cheap, coerced labor force. The rise in arrests and convictions was no accident. It was a calculated effort to feed the insatiable demand for labor that powered the South's recovery, all while keeping African Americans in a state of near slavery, decades after the Civil War had ended. This system, which reaped economic benefits for the South at the cost of black lives and freedom, underscored the brutal reality that emancipation was far from a universal truth in the post-war South. Instead, it was a hollow promise, overshadowed by a new form of bondage that perpetuated the racial and economic hierarchies of the antebellum era. The zeal with which law enforcement and the judiciary enforced these laws was a testament to the deep-seated racism that continued to define the Southern states, ensuring that the legacy of slavery endured long after its supposed abolition. When the oppressive grip of the Black Codes finally loosened in 1896, these racially inspired laws found new life in the form of Jim Crow laws. Far from being a mere continuation, Jim Crow laws represented a more entrenched and insidious system of racial segregation and discrimination, deeply embedded in the fabric of Southern society. These laws, designed to maintain the racial hierarchy and subjugation of African Americans, were not only supported but legitimized by the highest legal authority in the land, the Supreme Court. The landmark decision in Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896 codified the principle of separate but equal, effectively giving constitutional backing to state-sanctioned segregation. This ruling provided a legal framework for the Jim Crow era, allowing states to enforce racial segregation in all public facilities, from schools and transportation to restrooms and restaurants. The Supreme Court's endorsement of these laws made them nearly invincible, ensuring that racial discrimination was not just a social practice, but a legally protected norm. Under the guise of legality, Jim Crow laws institutionalized the disenfranchisement, economic exploitation, and social marginalization of African Americans. These laws were crafted to strip Black citizens of their civil rights, including the right to vote, the right to a fair trial, and the right to equal education and employment opportunities. The powers of the Constitution, twisted to serve the interests of white supremacy, were wielded to perpetuate a system of racial apartheid in the United States. The transition from the Black Codes to Jim Crow laws marked a dark chapter in American history, one in which the promise of freedom and equality was systematically undermined by a legal system complicit in upholding racial oppression. The Supreme Court's support for these laws further entrenched the division between Black and white Americans, embedding racism into the very structure of American law and governance for decades to come. Jim Crow laws established a racial caste system that operated across the United States, with its most pervasive impact felt in the South from 1877 until the mid-1960s. These laws effectively relegated African Americans to the status of second-class citizens, systematically excluding them from virtually every aspect of public life. Under Jim Crow, Black people were barred from using the same public transportation and facilities as whites, were denied access to jobs, education, and neighborhoods, and were even excluded from serving on juries or participating fully in politics. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution were designed to grant African Americans the same legal protections as their white counterparts, promising freedom, citizenship, and the right to vote. However, the election of President Rutherford B. Hayes in 1877 marked the beginning of a concerted effort by Southern states to roll back these liberties. Hayes's election effectively ended Reconstruction, as federal troops were withdrawn from the South, leaving Black citizens vulnerable to the resurgence of white supremacy. In 1896, the Supreme Court delivered a devastating blow to the progress made by these constitutional amendments with its decision in Plessy v. Ferguson. By upholding the doctrine of separate but equal, the court legitimized the Jim Crow laws, allowing states to continue enforcing racial segregation with the full backing of the Constitution. This ruling institutionalized racial discrimination, cementing the second-class status of African Americans and ensuring that the promises of freedom and equality remained unfulfilled for decades. During the Jim Crow era, the oppressive laws that enforced racial segregation and inequality placed Black people in constant danger. Violating a Jim Crow law, whether by drinking from a whites-only water fountain or attempting to exercise the right to vote, could have catastrophic consequences. A Black person's life, home, and livelihood were all at risk. White men, emboldened by the racial caste system, often physically assaulted Black individuals with impunity. The criminal justice system, entirely controlled by white police, prosecutors, judges, and juries, offered little to no recourse for Black victims of such violence. The most extreme and horrifying expression of this racial violence was lynching. Between 1882 and 1968, when consistent data collection began, there were 4,730 recorded lynchings in the United States. Of those victims, 3,440 were Black men and women. Lynching was not just an act of violence, but a deliberate tool of terror used to reinforce the racial hierarchy and suppress any challenge to white supremacy. It served as a public spectacle and a gruesome reminder to the black community of the severe consequences for stepping out of the confines of Jim Crow. These acts of violence were often carried out with the tacit or explicit approval of local authorities who either participated in or turned a blind eye to the atrocities. The criminal justice system was complicit in these crimes as the perpetrators were rarely brought to justice. In many cases, lynchings were carried out in broad daylight, with large crowds of white spectators, further illustrating the deep-seated racism that permeated American society during this era. The legacy of these acts of terror continues to haunt the United States, serving as a stark reminder of the brutal realities faced by African Americans under Jim Crow. The Jim Crow laws, along with their enduring grip on American society, were finally dismantled with the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This landmark legislation marked the culmination of a long and arduous struggle for true freedom and citizenship for African Americans. The journey of the freedmen and their descendants toward genuine liberation unfolded in two critical phases, both occurring after the Emancipation Proclamation and the ratification of the 13th Amendment. The first phase of this journey began as the Black Codes, which had sought to re-enslave African Americans through oppressive legal means, started to crumble. These laws, enacted immediately after the Civil War, were designed to strip freedmen of their rights and force them back into conditions resembling slavery. Under the Black Codes, freedmen were routinely whipped, beaten, and coerced into labor, perpetuating the brutal legacy of bondage under a different name. The second and final phase of this long march to freedom occurred nearly a century later, with the annulment of the Jim Crow laws by the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Jim Crow laws had systematically denied African Americans their humanity and citizenship, enforcing segregation and institutionalizing racial discrimination in every aspect of life. These laws ensured that African Americans remained second-class citizens, despite the constitutional amendments that had ostensibly granted them equal rights. It was not until these two oppressive legal frameworks were dismantled, the Black Codes in the post-Civil War era and the Jim Crow laws in the mid-20th century, that the descendants of the freedmen could truly be considered free and equal citizens of the United States. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a pivotal moment in American history, finally delivering on the promise of freedom and equality that had been so long denied to African Americans. It marked the end of an era of legalized racial oppression and opened the door to a new chapter in the ongoing struggle for civil rights and social justice. Slavery in the United States can be likened to a pair of iron fetters, each representing a fundamental aspect of oppression. One fetter signifying forced labor, and the other, the denial of humanity and citizenship. While the Civil War and the subsequent abolition of the Black Codes in 1896 began to weaken the first fetter by breaking the chain of forced labor, the second fetter, the denial of humanity and citizenship, remained firmly intact. This enduring bondage continued under the guise of Jim Crow laws, which perpetuated racial segregation and systemic discrimination. It wasn't until the passage of the Civil Rights Act on July 2, 1904, that the long-lasting iron fetter of Jim Crow was finally shattered. This legislation marked the official end of institutionalized racial discrimination, ensuring that the descendants of freedmen could no longer be legally denied their humanity and citizenship. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 symbolized the final eradication of both tenets of slavery, forced labor, and the denial of basic human rights that had bound African Americans for centuries. Thus, the institution of chattel slavery in the United States, with all its remnants and rebirths, was not truly dismantled until this pivotal moment in history, when both of these oppressive fetters were finally broken. This marked the end of a long and painful chapter in American history, and the beginning of a new era in the struggle for equality and justice. Frederick Douglass, the renowned abolitionist and statesman, powerfully highlighted the brutal reality faced by Black people in America when he referenced the infamous words of Chief Justice Roger B. Taney in the Dred Scott decision of 1857. In his ruling, Taney asserted that people of color were not intended to have any rights that a white man was bound to respect. This chilling declaration encapsulated the entrenched belief in white supremacy that permeated the legal and social fabric of the United States at the time. According to Taney, white men could, with impunity, commit heinous acts of violence against Black individuals, shooting, hanging, burning, whipping, and even starving them to death, without fear of legal consequence or moral reproach. His words were not just a legal opinion, they reflected a pervasive ideology that dehumanized black people and justified their continued subjugation. Douglass's reference to Taney's words underscored the harsh and unrelenting conditions that African Americans endured, conditions that were sanctioned by the highest court in the land. The Dred Scott decision was a stark reminder that, in the eyes of the law, black lives were considered devoid of value, and their rights were non-existent. This ruling, and the attitudes it embodied, fueled the fire of the abolitionist movement and reinforced the urgent need for systemic change in the pursuit of justice and equality for all. The Black Codes and Jim Crow laws, rooted in the ancient slave codes of the American South, were crafted to meet the economic and social demands of a post-emancipation society that was desperate to maintain the racial hierarchy established during slavery. These laws were designed to keep African Americans in a state of subjugation, mirroring the conditions of chattel slavery, where the legal status of black individuals was akin to that of movable property, owned and controlled by their former masters. Under these oppressive systems, the fundamental rights and freedoms of African Americans were systematically stripped away. Just as the chattel slave was forced into involuntary servitude, so too were the freedmen and their descendants bound by laws that curtailed their autonomy and subjected them to the will of white society. The offspring of slaves inherited the same conditions of bondage, ensuring that the cycle of oppression would continue across generations. These laws forbade African Americans from carrying weapons, stripping them of the means to defend themselves. They were prohibited from assembling in groups, whether by day or night, to prevent any form of organized resistance. The sale of commodities or produce was restricted without the express permission of their former masters, keeping them economically dependent and powerless. Furthermore, African Americans were denied any meaningful participation in the legal and civic spheres. They were barred from serving as arbitrators, experts, or partners in civil or criminal suits. Most egregiously, they were not allowed to give testimony against a white person, rendering them voiceless in the face of injustice. This legal framework ensured that African Americans remained at the mercy of a system designed to deny them their humanity, reinforcing their status as second-class citizens long after the abolition of slavery. These laws, though cloaked in the language of legality, were nothing more than a continuation of the brutal institution of slavery by another name. They perpetuated a system of racial control that sought to preserve the economic and social dominance of the white South, leaving African Americans trapped in a relentless cycle of oppression that would take generations to overcome. The conditions imposed upon freedmen under the Black Codes and their later iterations were eerily reminiscent of the oppressive circumstances endured by slaves. Although freedmen were no longer considered slaves in the legal sense, they found themselves trapped in a system of forced labor, often confined to prisons and movable cages, and subjected to harsh restrictions that echoed the brutal realities of chattel slavery. Their children were frequently apprenticed in arrangements that closely resembled the servitude their parents had endured, and their movements were heavily regulated, with strict prohibitions against traveling freely or assembling in groups. The legal system remained stacked against the freedmen, as they were denied the ability to bring criminal or civil claims against white individuals in court, effectively silencing them in the face of injustice. Those who worked in agriculture, whether as contract laborers or sharecroppers, were further constrained by laws that prevented them from selling or producing commodities without the explicit authorization of their overseers. These restrictions mirrored the same economic controls that had bound slaves to the land and to their masters, perpetuating a cycle of dependence and exploitation. The parallels between the institution of chattel slavery and the conditions imposed on freedmen under the Black Codes are undeniable. The so-called freedom granted to African Americans after the Civil War was, in reality, a continuation of the same oppressive structures that had defined slavery. The Black Codes and the contemporary laws that followed ensured that the freedmen and their descendants remained bound by the carbon print of slavery, denied true autonomy, economic independence, and legal protection. This shadow of slavery loomed over the lives of African Americans in both the South and the North well into the mid-20th century, reinforcing the systemic racism that persisted long after the formal end of slavery. Dear reader, I want to express my deepest gratitude to you for dedicating your time to explore the pages of this book. Your engagement with the stories, history, and reflections contained within is something I value immensely. My hope is that this book has not only sparked thought, but also inspired action and deepen your understanding of the remarkable legacy of Freedmen's Village. This book is more than just a narrative, it's part of a broader movement. I encourage you to take ownership of its message and join me in amplifying these stories. By leaving a review on Amazon, you can help others discover the rich history shared here. But let's not stop there. Share this book with friends, family, and your broader community. Together, we can ensure that the voices and histories of Freedmen's Village resonate far beyond these pages and are never forgotten. I'm excited to share that this is just the beginning. I have more books in the works, continuing to delve into the rich, often overlooked histories that have shaped our world. Additionally, I am in the early stages of planning a documentary film about Freedmen's Village, with the aim of bringing this critical history to life on screen. Thank you for being part of this journey with me. Let's keep the momentum going and ensure these stories continue to be told and remembered. With sincere gratitude, Dr. Gavin Harrell. Dear reader, I want to express my deepest gratitude to you for dedicating your time to explore the pages of this book. Your engagement with the stories, history, and reflections contained within is something I value immensely. My hope is that this book has not only sparked thought, but also inspired action and deepened your understanding of the dark legacy of Southern Black codes. This book is more than just a narrative, it's part of a broader movement. I encourage you to take ownership of its message and join me in amplifying these stories. By leaving a review on Amazon, you can help others discover the rich history shared here. But let's not stop there. Share this book with friends, family, and your broader community. Together, we can ensure that the voices and histories of the dark legacy of Southern Black codes resonate far beyond these pages and are never forgotten. I'm excited to share that this is just the beginning. I have more books in the works, continuing to delve into the rich, often overlooked histories that have shaped our world. Additionally, I am in the early stages of planning a documentary film about Freedmen's Village, with the aim of bringing this critical history to life on screen. Thank you for being part of this journey with me. Let's keep the momentum going and ensure these stories continue to be told and remembered. With sincere gratitude, Dr. Gavin Harrell.
Once again, thank you for joining us today and listening to this audiobook. We truly appreciate your time and support. I'd like to invite you to please like, comment, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. By doing so, you're not just staying connected, you're becoming part of an exclusive community dedicated to celebrating knowledge, culture, and empowerment. If you're interested in the ebook or paperback edition of this audiobook, head over to our Amazon page. You'll find the link in the description below. And for those of you looking to show your support in other ways, we've got custom t-shirts, hoodies, and beautiful African wall art available. Just click the merchandise link in the description to check it out. Thank you and enjoy the audiobook.